Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have a whopper of an episode for you. We're discussing the subject of whether there is a dose-response relationship between training volume and muscle growth. I have Buckner and Holly Baxter on the show, who recently authored a paper that put some doubts into this relationship. Sam hasn't been on the podcast before, so to let you know a little bit about him, he is the director of the University of South Florida Muscle Laboratory. The lab's research focuses on muscle skeletal adaptation, and their current work places an emphasis on understanding the relationship between resistance training volume and skeletal growth adaptations, hence that paper and our discussion today. In addition to them, I have the all-star team that is Menno Henselmans and Josh Pelland, who have both been on the show before, and they're going to try and help us get a deeper understanding of this relationship. And Josh has also been working on a soon-to-be-released meta-analysis looking at training volume and muscle growth. So he is adding some invaluable insights into this discussion too. The discussion was incredibly valuable. So many important things that have been discussed and that are going to help future research too, and help your understanding when you are digesting some of this research, which the paper is linked in the description, along with everyone who is on the show today, all their information so you can find out anything about each individual guest and follow them along on social media too, so you know that's there as well. And we finished the episode with practical recommendations so you can take this information forward into your own training, or if you are a coach, for your own clients. And as always, guys, this podcast cannot have such caliber of guests and great episodes without help from you, whether that's a like, a comment, a share, a review. All of these are incredibly helpful, especially photos that you can take and share on social media, tag every guest. That will really help this episode to grow and flourish. And it also helps the guests coming on, kind of pays them for their time in a sense with this kind of social media outlet as well. So I appreciate all of that sharing. But without further ado, let's get into the chat. So Holly, we were just talking off air and you had a really interesting thought about how we might intro this whole discussion. And that is kind of giving your background and maybe giving some insights into where you're coming from, maybe a bias even. And so I thought I'd just literally hand it directly over to you. And so you can kind of cover where you're coming from and maybe some perspectives that's kind of, the perspective that you have now when you're looking at training volume research and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. No pressure at all. Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for making the time for all of us to meet. I know it's been a little bit of a handful getting this together, not only with so many people, but also I know you've had some personal stresses in your life that have made it a bit more challenging. So I think we're all grateful for the opportunity to be here today. But you're exactly right. I think I wanted to maybe start by talking about each of our individual perspectives on the subject of muscle hypertrophy in relation to training volume. Obviously, we're here to talk about our recent publication. But I think I want to start with maybe Menno, because I've known Menno known of Menno for the longest. And I think he brings a wealth of information to the table. I mean, I've followed not only his social media, we've presented at seminars in person together. I think he delivers a really wide variety of great health and fitness content in general, which is fantastic. And I know he's also got a lot of businesses in this space. I know that you do courses, you run seminars, you're traveling the world, which we just heard about moments ago, and you're spending a lot of time, in that social media space. So I think he has a very different perspective than maybe even someone like Josh, who I know is currently doing his PhD in the space of training muscle hypertrophy adaptations and volume. So I think his perspective is going to be really unique and interesting in the context of today's discussion. And actually only recently found out about Josh through your podcast too, which I really enjoyed listening to that. So thanks, guys. It was awesome. And then I'm going to leave Sam till last, but, deviating back to myself, I think I come from perspective of nutritional sciences primarily. So I did my undergrad in food science, nutrition, background in, dietetics. So very heavy on the nutrition side, but I also have a really strong interest in muscle hypertrophy and growth. From a couple of perspectives, personally, my career right now is very much involved in the physique sport. So I compete as a professional physique athlete still. I've been doing that for almost a decade now. So I'm really, really interested in how I can take the evidence information that exists and apply it to what I'm doing practically in the gym. but then also applying that to my businesses and the clients that we work with in a one-on-one perspective. And I think that's really important because we all come from this from a different space. And it wasn't really until recently when I started writing a book and I spent a bit more time with Sam. He actually was my mentor and advisor in this recent book writing. That one of the things that I noticed was that his perspective as a professor and full-time researcher who's in the lab writing research, running research, and reading a lot was actually quite a bit different to what I had heard in the land of social media and what was being communicated by other social media influencers in the evidence-based space. So I'm actually really excited to hear what he's got to say today, because I think what I have learned just over the last several months of working really closely with Sam, I don't think has quite made it to mainstream social media. And whilst there's a lot of overlap, I think, in the conversations that all of us are going to have today, I think he actually had quite unique perspectives. And it's really interesting. I loved talking to him about this because it just wasn't being communicated, over on Instagram or YouTube or Twitter or what have you, because he is so in the lab. So with that being said, I mean, I want to kick this over to Sam. Obviously, he's the lead author on our paper on training volume. So Sam, take it away.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad you find my perspective interesting. I think some people find it annoying, but yeah, this paper was exciting to write, and I think for me it was a long time coming. And Holly, you played a large part in encouraging me to write this paper because I would see posts every day on Instagram, and I'd get so frustrated, and I'd get frustrated because oftentimes I feel like one side of an argument or one perspective gets communicated. And when one popular person has a perspective, other people share their perspective, and then it kind of propagates and travels. And I think that the catalyst for this paper was actually maybe a 2-week time span where I saw 24 posts on why you need to take long rest periods if you care about maximizing skeletal muscle growth. And I was aware of the research behind this recommendation, and this one rest period paper, and the data for me was just a little too good to be true. So I was cautious in my interpretation of that particular study. And then another study had come out where they had different groups where they volume matched or took long rest, short rest, and volume matched. And when I read that study, I realized that it was kind of designed to fail, in my opinion. But I realized the problem was I had a different perspective than a lot of people reading research. And this perspective was driven by the fact that when I read a paper, I think about how much muscle growth is occurring, and I interpret that in the context of my experience and what I've read in other papers. And the example I gave in class the other night is if we read a paper, and in that paper at the group level, squat 1RM increases by 500 pounds. Everyone's going to go, hold on, wait a second. How did squat 1RM increase 500 pounds in people who've been habitually lifting, right? That would be something that would raise a bit of caution, and we would say, you know what, we need to replicate this study. But when it comes to skeletal muscle growth, I don't think we have the same intimate relationship or knowledge of what changes in muscle size might look like, or perhaps should look like. And so volume was kind of the vehicle I used to start this discussion. And I think volume is a really relevant area to discuss because it is so prevalent on social media. It's you could find a dozen podcasts in the past 3 months on volume. And in all of these discussions, what I noticed is they talk about group A was different than group B, but they don't talk about what's the magnitude difference between these groups. Because sometimes you'll read a study, and that study will have on average 2 sets difference weekly. Or like let's say one group's doing 22 sets, the other group's doing 24 sets on average. But then the muscle growth is double. So someone might say, oh, it's significantly different. This group grew better than this group. But what I do when I read that paper is I go, how was 4 sets or 2 sets difference able to achieve double the growth? So I want to have that conversation instead of a conversation, this technique was better than this technique. And that's how I approach most of the muscle growth research. I have, I don't know, just a fascination with, how much muscle growth can we achieve over time, right? And what should muscle growth look like over 8 weeks? I think when we read a study, we should have some type of expectation, just like we have some type of expectation of, how much can your bench press increase over 8 weeks, over 12 weeks, over 6 months? Um, so, I hope this is how the paper is received because, my sincere hope with this paper is that people think about muscle maybe just a little bit differently and perhaps a little bit more critically. Um, and I don't want to go on too long and I don't want to take up too much of the conversation, but there's some really interesting things we can talk about. You know, when I was helping or advising Holly with the book she was writing, I think she has a chapter on the limits of human skeletal muscle growth. Assuming you're not using anabolic steroids. And I tend to think that a person who's, natty, not using anabolics, can probably increase their muscle size somewhere around 1.5 centimeters throughout their training career, right? So when you see a study that has 0.7 in 8 weeks, to me, that's very, very impressive, right? So I want to have a discussion on, okay, how did this happen? And is this possible? Or is it possible that there's some swelling or inflammation that we're conflating as muscle growth? That to me is a more interesting conversation some of the time than a debate over this technique versus that technique. And so one of the first things we talk about in this paper is evidence for and evidence against a dose-response relationship between resistance training volume and muscle growth. And in that conversation, we kind of framed that I believe, at least on social media, we're a bit more critical of studies that don't observe a dose-response relationship, and we're a bit more accepting of studies that do see a dose-response relationship. And this will be my last point, and I promise I'll quiet down and let everyone speak. But I think a good example is the Ennis paper. The Ennis paper, the 52 set paper, did not find significant differences between their groups, right? But I've heard, again, probably a dozen podcasts on why, despite not being significant, it's still meaningful. And I was talking to somebody the other day, and I said, if that same study did not reach statistical significance, but was leaning towards moderate volumes being better than high volumes, no one would talk about it. And no one would break down why it's not significant, but we still know that this is better than that. And then in the context of the Ennis, and I'm just using this as an example, when you look at the Ennis paper, they crafted muscle CSA by taking muscle thickness images, putting them in PowerPoint, and tracing the cross-sectional area. When you do that, you get a lot of error, right? And when you get a lot of error, you need a control group to know how meaningful is my difference between this group and that group. Because it could very well be that that difference that you think you're finding is actually error of the measurement. And maybe we'll get into that paper a bit later. But the last thing, using the Ennis paper as an example, in a podcast I listened to recently where they were breaking down that 52 set paper, and Steve, it was on your podcast, and you did a great job. I really enjoyed the podcast, listened to it a few times. But in that discussion, Brad said that people that are questioning the Ennis paper and suggesting that there's swelling and inflammation, he said it more than once, that people that are criticizing this study have a bias and some sort of agenda. And when I listened to that, maybe he misspoke and maybe he would share a different view, but I thought that was an unfortunate perspective, because people saying that when you do 52 sets, there's possibility that swelling and inflammation could be influencing your measurement. I think that's a very legitimate criticism. We've looked at swelling, but we've looked at swelling following, the DeMoss paper that was cited, looked at 12 weekly sets. Right. And they said it took 3 weeks into doing 12 sets, you still have too much swelling to measure growth. So when you progress your volume up to 52, it's a novel stimulus. And when it's only for the last 2 weeks of the study, it's very possible, in my perspective, that you have swelling, that you have inflammation, and that it's at least conceivable and shouldn't be dismissed that the non-significant increase in the large variability is driven by differences in swelling and inflammation. And I just think the Ennis paper is a good example because it's relevant right now and everyone's talking about it. But yeah, with that, I guess I'll open it up to a discussion on evidence for and against dose response. But I believe that the data is very unclear and kind of all over the place. Sorry
Lot
for the
said.
monologue.
No, it was good. It was good also with Holly kind of basing everyone's background, because I recently had Eduardo de Souza on, who was on that paper where he was kind of giving all the caveats to volume research, because I think he probably had a somewhat of a similar perspective, maybe some frustrations of how some things have been interpreted or spoken about. So I think it is useful to have, because I think even lab coats guys in the lab, they get kind of like a hard time because they're not lifting and they haven't got like experience with many clients and things like this. So I think this is what I love about this podcast, is getting people like everyone on this who have like many perspectives to share and insights that I think are truly valuable. So I appreciate that. And yeah, I can appreciate some of your sentiments surrounding kind of some of your skepticism there. And I think it's a question to be had. And I guess I would pass over some of those questions to Menno if you have any particular thoughts, if you want to go first, and then maybe Josh can come in afterwards.
Sure. There are a lot of things to talk about. Let's start, I think, with the big picture. As far as I'm concerned, I think Sam raises a lot of very good points. And in general, it's well known that small studies tend to find inflated effect sizes. So I think what we can get in terms of how much muscle can you build, what's the magnitude of difference between 5 and 10 sets, looking at one individual study is going to get you very unclear answers. And depending on which study you look at, the difference might be very, very different. It's also well known that in exercise science, we are in a relatively new field. It's basically since the 90s or so that we've really had evidence-based fitness. And it's not a popular field. It's difficult to get subjects. So most of the studies are small. If you compare it to, say, psychological literature or economical literature, the field of literature in general is not good. So in individual studies in general are not going to be extremely informative. And that's why I think it is very important to look at meta-analyses to get like a big picture view when we have sufficient studies and they are relatively comparable. And what meta-analyses do is, when you look at a big picture of multiple studies, it takes away a big part of the type 2 error. So the fact that individual comparisons between groups are very unlikely to become significant. And especially in these dose response studies, when we're talking about 20, 30 subjects, and you have 3 groups, like low, medium, high volume, is going to be very difficult to find a significant difference between every measure in every single group. So the bar of evidence from a scientific perspective to really get a clear dose response, because as Sam said, that is what you would want. You would want to see this is different from this is different from this. Then we can say there's a dose response. And we kind of, many practitioners at least, allow some leeway with that standard when the trend in general is a dose response, and we don't necessarily see that it's statistically different between groups for every single comparison. And if we look at meta-analyses, volume is a very strong driver of muscle growth. We have the Basvalle meta-analyses of higher volumes, the Schoenfeld meta-analyses of 10 plus sets. We have Krieger's original meta-analyses. We also have unofficial further meta-analyses by Krieger. And we have 2 relatively recent ones, one involving Stuart Phillips and another one that I reviewed them on my YouTube channel. They basically took a super big picture view and looked at, okay, if we look at all the variables that might matter for muscle growth, which are the ones that are somewhat consistent, really consistent by their standards. And volume came out as one of the big ones for muscle growth. So in that sense, when we take a really big picture view, I do think the evidence is quite robust, and from a practical standpoint, enough to say that if you want to maximize muscle growth, you probably want to err on the side of higher volumes, provided that you can recover from that. That's basically my view as a practitioner. And there's a, to come back to Holly, it's good to realize that there's a very big difference here between whether we are talking about it from a scientific perspective or whether we are talking about it from a practitioner's perspective. Like, given the costs and benefits and the probabilities of what's likely to happen in terms of how much muscle you're going to gain and your goals, that's the practitioner's perspective. And then the scientific perspective is, hey, can we really say with a very, very high level of confidence that indeed there is going to be a difference between 20 and 15 sets? And I think before we ever get to that point, it's going to be a long time, because it's also going to be very individual. So we have to, from a practical standpoint, I think, take the scientific literature with the perspective with its limitations in mind. Let me put it that way. So that's kind of my big picture perspective, and I'm sure we can go into all of the individual points, because there are some good ones about the your paper about saying red Schoenfeld's effect sizes, or at least the raw measurement values, are extremely high. One of the rest intervals paper I was also involved with, so we can also get into that. But I'll leave that to you, Steve, because it's your show.
No, great to hear your perspective, and drawing us back to kind of why meta-analyses are so beneficial there. And all the ones that have gone in the past so far have obviously shown that volume is pretty damn important. I'll pass it over to Josh to see if you have any additional comments or perspectives to add there, and then I'll hand it over to Holly or Sam, depending on who feels like they want to go next.
Yeah, I'll try to make this quick, because I'm excited to dive into some of the finer points here, because like Menno said, I think Sam brings up a lot of good points. But to take a step back, I'd say I'm generally of two minds here. And that's because I'm a scientist right now, and I'm also a strength coach. And then kind of when I can fit it in, create some content for the internet as well. And kind of to second Menno's point there, I think it's easy for the content creator to point the finger or to critique the scientist. And it's also easy the other way around. It's easy for the scientist to critique the content creator. And I'm sympathetic to both perspectives, because at least to some degree, I've been in both of those positions. And it's not easy, because ultimately you have different audiences, right? Scientific papers in exercise science are often read by practitioners or just interested trainees. But at the end of the day, they are designed for other scientists, whereas content for the internet is primarily designed for the trainee themselves or other coaches. And it's challenging, because, I put out what I think was a very balanced perspective on something like the Ennis study. And the creation of that, or kind of taking that balanced approach, you are choosing less engagement as a result of that approach, right? And I don't think there's a right answer here. I think it is a difficult problem. And again, that's why I'm sympathetic towards both perspectives. And it's just not easy for, again, both the scientist and for the content creator. So I'm kind of two minds there. I don't want to misattribute this tweet, but I saw this tweet from some scientist in our field, and it was something to the effect of, the only thing I can say with a high degree of confidence is that resistance training works. And I do think there's some truth to that, right? But then as a practitioner, as a trainee or as a coach, you also need to make decisions. And again, kind of to Menno's point, you need to create suggestions that are not like overly complex in the absence of certainty. And because it's a relatively new field, there is a high degree of uncertainty. And specifically regarding training volume, so as I think someone alluded to earlier, my PhD is in kind of this realm of training volume. It's more specifically on skeletal muscle resensitization, but there's a lot of overlap here with volume in general. And I agree with a lot of Sam's point about reading exercise science research critically and contextualizing those findings. I couldn't agree more with that. And on this topic of training volume, something that we're interested in as a lab group, and something we're in progress of, is to better understand that dose response relationship, and the nature of that dose response relationship, and the certainty of that dose response relationship at different levels of training volume. So we're in progress of some meta regressions right now, that instead of just kind of dichotomizing, okay, this was a low volume study, this was a high volume study, we can get some better insight into, again, the nature of that relationship, because there is a lot of variability, which both Menno and Sam pointed out, right? There's biological variability, there's measurement variability, there's sampling variability. There's just a lot going on that makes any one study, especially in small sample research like our field, and also generally small effects, very difficult to interpret until you have, like Menno said, a meta-analysis or meta-regression or something to that effect. So I think that's why I think this discussion is worth having. I definitely have some thoughts on some of the specific points raised, but I guess I'm kind of doubling down on both perspectives presented up to this point.
Josh, just because I'm going to push you for an answer, because so Menno thinks there is a dose-response relationship, I think, from your answer there. And obviously Sam said he thinks there's maybe some question. He's got some questions. I mean, that's what the whole paper is about. Do you have like a sense of direction with that relationship for yourself?
Yeah, what I can say at this point is from kind of our preliminary steps here within the actual analysis perspective, right? The extraction is essentially done here. The whole point of the project is to better understand the nature of the relationship and contextualize the variability within that relationship and the effects we see. But what I can say again from a preliminary perspective is that similar to how Schoenfeld in 2017 saw a significant relationship in terms of a linear model between volume and standardized effective hypertrophy, we also found that, right, with a lot more studies in there. So I do think there is a dose-response relationship. Our kind of preliminary results would indicate that, but that's a very, very small part of the project because there are a lot of other research questions we're attempting to answer. But I would, I guess, fall more on that pro-volume side of things from a practitioner perspective. But again, I'm sympathetic, or I'm very understanding of some of the limitations of the research in general.
Yeah, I would add that I think very few people, not to put words in Sam's mouth, but I think also Sam probably doesn't think there really isn't any dose response. It's almost self-evident that there is a dose response. I don't think there are a lot of people that think, oh, if you do 1 set per month, for example, that's pretty much it. And then if you do 2 sets, no, for no further difference, a set every week, no, it doesn't matter. It's just 1 set a month is good, right? Or maybe even per year. So there is clearly some type of dose response effect. So the question is, how does that curve look and how many sets are we looking at? And I think these days we're mostly looking at the amount of sets per muscle group per week, and we're kind of figuring out where exactly that curve stops. Does it plateau and does it go down? And then the current thinking by most people is that we have this inverted U curve where you get benefits up to a certain point, which is generally thought to be in the range of 10 to 20 sets. And I think it can be higher. And there are a lot of studies, especially like the Innes paper, that suggest it might be much higher under certain circumstances, at least. And then at some point, we would expect it to taper off and actually become negative. Like you would actually start hurting your gains because you're overreaching and then overtraining. So I guess that's kind of the current thinking, more in terms of where the curve lies than really whether there is any dose response.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think that was fair. I don't think Sam thinks there's no relationship like dose response at all. I think you have to do something. We're not like Mike Mensa kind of advocates in that regard. It's just maybe his perspective. Well, I won't speak for Sam, but I'm guessing your perspective might be to question some of how high and how much of a difference those additional sets make that are coming out within some of the research. But I don't know if you had any points you wanted to raise, Sam, kind of based off Menno and Josh's.
Yeah, I would suspect that our volume recommendations would probably be pretty similar. I think all of us here would actually probably have pretty consistent agreement. My critique is more so one of the literature and some of the studies that are used to make certain points. And I think the volume literature is it's used on this more macro basis, and again, I think the rest period is just a good example because within this session, if you rest shorter and you reduce your volume, you lose out on gains, right? That's an example. It's not weekly sets. It's within session volume. And I think probably a lot of my critiques are more focusing on that within session volume. And, I don't even think of volume as weekly because I think that's problematic, right? If you told me you did 20 weekly sets for quads, well, if you did all those 20 weekly sets in one session, right, I think you wasted a lot of your time. If you split it up against three sessions, it becomes more interesting, right? So, and using the extreme example of the 52 set paper, you're doing 9 sets. I mean, at the highest volume, you're doing 9 sets of leg press, 9 sets of squat. And you're following that with 8 sets of knee extension. So on that extreme end, my critique there is I think you maximize what you can get out of the leg press after around your 3rd or 4th set of that exercise. After that, you're contracting your muscle, you're burning some calories, but I don't think you're getting more out of that. And then you move on to the squat. And, you already have some fatigue in those muscles. You've already activated some muscle growth in those muscles, but you're probably hitting some of the musculature in a different way. You need to fatigue and activate those fibers to stimulate them to growth. But certainly within a session, there's a point where in a lot of these studies we're contracting, but I see no physiological reason to believe you're getting more muscle growth. I had a conversation with another podcast host because I just reached out and I said, in your podcast on volume, you talked about weekly volume the whole time, but you got to break it down to what they're doing per session, right? Because if you have a lot of volume and you're telling me that volume works, but it's organized in a way that makes no sense, and I'm not saying the study makes no sense. I'm saying I don't see any reason to ever do 9 sets of an exercise because I don't think the muscle protein synthetic response is infinite. The example I use in class, and my analogies are horrible, so I apologize to all of y'all. But I with volume equation, my first example was if it takes a frozen pizza 30 minutes to cook, you wouldn't take that pizza out of the freezer, put it in the oven for 10 minutes on Monday, put it back in the freezer, take it out on Wednesday, put it in the oven for 10 minutes, put it back in the freezer, and then take it out on Friday, put it in the oven for 10 minutes and put it back in the freezer. You never fully cooked your pizza. You never enjoyed your pizza. You never accomplished anything. And this analogy, I know it falls apart, but hopefully it lands. That's why I don't like volume equated studies, because you need that 30 minutes. You don't need 10 minutes 3 times and putting it back in the freezer. But on the same token, if it takes 30 minutes to cook a pizza, you're not going to take it out of the freezer and put it in the oven for an hour and a half. And in my opinion, some of these studies are just way overdoing it. But back to my point, my conversation with this podcast host, I said, certainly somewhere after the 4th or 5th set, you're not accomplishing additional gains. But he said, yeah, I don't see why you wouldn't. And I suppose some people just have the perspective that if you do more, you will gain more. But I don't think this is true. I don't think this could be true. And I noticed, when Milo and Pack were making their memes, in the comment section on that volume, I saw people just saying, we tested this SHIT in the trenches, like saying, I've trained with this type of volume, or I can do this type of volume. Well, you know what? I could do it myself, I think. But just because you can do something doesn't mean it's doing anything meaningful for an adaptation, right? I could go do 50 sets right now of biceps, right? But I know somewhere after my 3rd or 4th set, I've maximized the response I can get out of those fibers in that moment. And if I do additional sets, that's cool. I mean, I'm delaying my recovery. I'm delaying my ability to train again in a couple of days. But I think the intersession volume is probably the discussion that's more interesting to me, because I think of muscle as you walk in the gym, you have a baseline muscle, you want to maximize the muscle protein synthetic response in each movement that you're performing. So in each movement, at what point is that contraction no longer eliciting an anabolic response? And I heard Keith Barr on a podcast probably a decade ago, and he said he suspects that with single joint movements, simple movements, that you get 80 to 90% of the response out of your first set if you're training to near failure. Sets 2, 3, and 4 are the insurance policy to make sure you've activated and stimulated and sufficiently fatigued all of the fibers involved in that movement. If that's true, and I'm not saying that's necessarily true, I'm saying I largely believe that to be true, what are you accomplishing with set 5, set 6, set 7, set 8, set 9? Like, what's happening beyond there physiologically? And I think that's a worthwhile discussion to have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely made sense. And I find myself as a practitioner agreeing with you in terms of thinking about leg press. And I think it was 9 sets you said. I'm like, hell, I'm struggling with 3, let alone trying to push further than that. But I also have to frame it in terms of individual differences. And I guess this is where your skepticism of the Enos paper comes in, where they did see better growth from having pushed to such a point, but that's where you're seeing just the potential for swelling being there, which I don't know if we want to jump to that discussion point already, or if if Menno or if you, Josh, have any comments to that, or Holly, you clearly do, so you can go.
I'd love to jump in, but I'm hesitant to start speaking because apparently my neighbors decided to jackhammer their floors and bring out the sledgehammer today. I'm really having a hard time hearing you guys. It's so noisy here. So I'll try to keep this brief, but I think really great points from everybody. But I mean, I look at this from the practical sense in that, as somebody that is, writing programs for people a lot, I think, with all of the high volume training studies that are coming to the surface, number one, I think it's great that we're exploring high volume training. If it has the potential to produce more meaningful outcomes, then that's fantastic. But I think our argument is less about, that there is potentially this, linear response, but more about the actual growth measurements that we've seen coming out of some of the Schoenfeld lab studies. And again, if we look back to our paper, we present some 75 instances from various studies where the mean at a group level growth outcomes are about 0.4 of a centimeter on average. Whereas these couple of papers in, these findings are showing, upwards of 0.68, 0.72. So, we're looking at magnitudes that are, twofold and in some cases up to sevenfold greater than what we're seeing in all these other studies. Now, it may very well be true, until we have more studies, I think, that are assessing these high volume scenarios. I don't know that we can discredit that information. And I don't think that's what we're doing, at least not how we've portrayed it in our paper. But I think that we do need to exercise a bit of caution purely from a practical perspective. If I'm about to sit down and write my program for Miss Betty, who's in her mid-40s, and she wants to get good results, am I going to sit down and give her 45 working sets on a specific muscle group? If she wants to improve her glutes or her shoulders, is that a volume that I want to prescribe, given that I know it's about to take her 2 hours in the gym? And I'm potentially, risking an injury. It's a lot of time and energy and effort. We want to really make sure that what we're prescribing is sound before we go ahead and make these blanket recommendations. And I think one of the points that Sam made earlier, and I apologize if you can hear that jackhammer, it is really frustrating for me.
Actually can't.
Oh, you can't? Great. Wonderful. So I think one of the points that Sam made before, and now I'm distracted totally, was that, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Remind me what I was just saying.
Taking the results at face value.
Yeah, I think we just have to be really, I think we have to be really mindful of what we, communicate to our clients and also what we prescribe, because it's a lot of volume. And right now we don't have a large global amount of research that would suggest that this is factual. If we look at all of the other growth outcomes, they're, significantly less. So yeah, I think that's kind of the perspective that I wanted to have. And I hope we can kind of talk a little bit more about, what other studies do we see with this amount of growth? And at least from what we can account in the literature, there were only, 2 or 3 papers that have found meaningful results of this magnitude. And some of them have been retracted. Some of them are in or comparable to studies with people using anabolic steroids. So I know I've really just jumped this to another level, but I think it's just worth putting that into context with the rest of the research. So.
Yeah, I think your points make complete sense. I just, as a complete side note, I posted a story of like my weekly set volume for my quads. And I had a few people message me and they were like, that was just one workout, right? I was like, no, that was like my week. They're like, and a few people said, oh, did you not see the Enos study? I'm like, yeah, I saw the study, but I mean, that's not, I don't suddenly, I want my quads to grow, but I mean, I also want to be able to recover, which is a key point Menno said at the beginning there. It's like people need to be recovering from this. And I don't know how many people listening to the podcast would be able to. Go ahead, Holly.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, one of the things that I did as soon as I read the 52 set, paper, and I guess obviously the whole study isn't, 52 sets per week. It's obviously progressively increasing, every 2 weeks. But I went back and looked at my most difficult training sessions. So in one of my heaviest builds back in 2020, and I'm looking at them right now. And I know that my glute and shoulders for me as a female competitor are the most important muscle groups as a bikini competitor. And the most number of weekly sets that I did on my lower body in total was about 80 sets, of which 30 to 35 of those were specifically on glutes. And that was evenly distributed between glute medius and glute max. So when I look at the other exercises that I was including in that program, the next closest weekly set volume, and I know Sam talked specifically about session volume, and I know that's really important. So again, we have to give context to how we then set up a program for our clients. But the next closest for me as a professional fitness athlete, I was doing 30 sets on my quads, and then it drops down pretty significantly to only 20, and then everything less, or was less from my upper body. So, there's a big difference here in, these training volumes. And those sessions took me about 90 minutes to 2 hours in total. So, I look at that and say, that's a huge amount of volume. Now, I'm happy to prescribe that to clients as well if they want really good results. But I think the bigger question is that necessary? And I don't know that we're quite there yet in terms of having enough volume of studies to really support that, doing that kind of volume. In the case of the Schoenfeld study, where they're doing 45 sets in the high volume group, is that necessary? I've never done that in my entire career, and I'm a professional athlete, and it takes a lot of time. So I just want to be really skeptical, at least cautious rather, in how we interpret that information and then portray that to the lay person.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And I'm actually interested to hear Menno and Josh's thoughts on kind of that skepticism over the results from Brad's lab. Like, they are quite out there in terms of the results that they've seen. How have you looked at that? Have you also had that kind of similar skepticism? Don't know if Menno, you want to start.
Right. So it's mainly about the Brad Schoenfeld's rest interval study and his 45 set volume study. I was involved in the rest interval study. Let me start with what probably is, at least for some listeners, implied potentially, is the legitimacy of Brad Schoenfeld's results. And I would say that Brad Schoenfeld is one of the most reputable researchers that literally has the track record of disproving his own hypotheses the most of almost anyone I know in exercise science. So he probably has the record of the amount of times that he has published research that has falsified his own methods, falsified what he advocated in his own books. So I definitely don't have any fears of Brad Schoenfeld's results being crooked. Also, I've analyzed the results. James Krieger has analyzed the results. And with all due respect to Brad Schoenfeld, I don't think he would be able to fraud the data to not have it visible for these studies. So I don't think data fraud, not that anyone's implying it, but I know that listeners will think it is at least implied, is really a concern here. I think maybe he does the ultrasound measurements of his own studies most of the time. That could play a role. It's a small study. You get high effect sizes. In your paper, you looked at the total results. I don't know if you also looked at the effect sizes. I think those are smaller. They're a little bit less outlying. So then that would mean that the variance is also higher. The results are also, they are high. I think in Greg Knuckles' or the white paper that Greg Knuckles et al. Did on the Barbalio studies, they found that Barbalio studies, which are about the same level of outlier, are indeed certainly outliers, but there are multiple other papers when you extend the search a bit below or above other types of studies. There are other studies that have found these types of results. The Brigato study is not too far off. And of course, part of it is that the idea is that the results are indeed better because higher volumes are better, right? So it's also kind of implied that we get these higher effect sizes because the volume actually works. So regardless of all of that, I totally agree that the interpretation of these effect sizes or magnitudes from that study alone and extrapolating that to the percentage gain difference that you would get in practice is 100% not doable. And just is completely falsified as well by the other literature, because there are also multiple other studies that don't find nearly such effects. So we have to look at these more meta-analyses to look at really what kind of incremental gains are we getting by increasing the volume above this level. And I think almost everybody would probably agree with that. And there are very few practitioners that I know that even consider 45 or 52 sets. Also 52 was what they ended up with at the end, right? You would have to kind of look at the average, I think. And then the study essentially said you probably want to do over 22 and maybe even over 30, 32 or 35. And I mean, these things sound ridiculous to practitioners, to some practitioners at least. Some bodybuilders would say, oh, and like maybe the ones that DM Steve, and they scoff at these figures. But us mere mortals, we find it difficult to conceive of the fact that anybody would benefit of 45 sets per week per muscle group. However, this is not an isolated finding. Yes, Brad Schoenfeld 45 set study found it, but it was a replication of the Red Daily study in the Brazilian Navy. After that, we have the Ennis paper that recently came out. We have the Brigato study. So it is not, it may be an outlier in terms of the amount of ultrasound centimeters muscle thickness difference that they found, but it is not an outlier in the general trend of the research. We have multiple very different papers that have found this dose response. And then a few other papers, the Aub and Ostrowski et al., however you pronounce it, that did not find real dose response. And even the German volume training study, which found that at some point it becomes negative, which what most people also would think that. So again, that's why we have to look at what happens when you meta-analyze it, put it all together, and then see where do we get this curve. And then in the grand scheme of things, even 5 studies that in exercise science, considering the amount of variability between people in how much muscle they gain, if you compare Arnold Schwarzenegger or the average individual, right, you're going to get massive differences as well. So then even then, yeah, 5 studies is not that much to go with. But to get back to the point about Brad Schoenfeld's results, I don't think these results are incredible. I think we expect that, there's going to be one paper at least that has the highest value. If we eliminate Schoenfeld's study, then what's the next highest one? Then we look at the Brigato paper and be like, oh, that one is really high, right? So at least some papers going to be highest. It is maybe somewhat curious that 2 of those papers are from Brad Schoenfeld's lab, but I have very little doubt that there is a malicious explanation for that.
Yeah, let me just step in and say there, Menno, I don't think for a second, at least from my perspective, Sam may speak for himself. I don't think that we think that it's fabricated data, that's for sure. I think we've just kind of had lots of discussions around the potential implications of swelling with, such increases in training volume and in such short time span as well. So I just wanted to clarify that. I know that it might have sounded that way, but certainly wasn't intended to be.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. From what I hear, he's a great human and he does really cool stuff, has cool ideas. So, and if he listens to this, keep doing what you do. Questioning, I mean, my data is definitely going to be questioned. I'm sure a lot of it has my stuff on periodization for sure. It makes us all better, talking about magnitudes of growth, if it turns out to be true. And I was just wrong here today. We're better for talking about it and better understanding a magnitude of growth. So, yeah, man, I definitely don't think I wouldn't leverage any. I don't think there's anything nefarious going on. I think it's an interesting finding, and I think personally, I want to know more about it. But I would push back a little bit on how much we can actually learn from a meta, because, when you look at the studies individually, I still like the Brigato study. My major issue, the Brigato study, right, which was at 16, 24, 32, I think, weekly sets. Statistically, 32 is different than 16, but 32 wasn't different than 24. But my main issue with this study is they used A-mode ultrasound. Now, A-mode ultrasound was designed to be able to, it's a fairly new technology. I think it's about 10 years old. Well, 10 years old in our applied exercise science world. But when the IntelliMatrix came out, it was designed for body composition. And it's been used in a few studies to measure muscle growth. And I don't think we included the Brigato in our study because it didn't even make my table of muscle size, because I do not believe you can measure muscle growth with A-mode ultrasound. And I will explain why. When you use A-mode, it's for the listener, I know you guys might be privy to this, but when you use A-mode ultrasound, it sends a single wave down and it comes back. So when you image muscle, you're meant to look at the muscle, you're meant to center the muscle bone interface so you can have a consistent and reliable measure. With A-mode ultrasound, you have no live imaging. You put this probe on the muscle belly and you push a button and it sends a signal down and it comes back. And you don't know what interface you're detecting. You have no ability to differentiate there. So we did a study probably 4 or 5 years ago, and we were able to measure acute swelling with amodal ultrasound, but I have little to no confidence in our ability to measure growth with amodal ultrasound. And you have thousands of waves traveling down into bimodal ultrasound probe, one single signal amodal ultrasound. And maybe with training you could do it, but your error when you're using amodal ultrasound to measure muscle is going to be incredible. And especially, did they have a control group in Brigado? I can't remember, but you would absolutely need a control group to know, can I even replicate the same number consistently over an 8 to 12 week time period? And that's just Brigado. But if we look at some of these other studies, I think didn't Aub, and I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but the Aub study on its own, I feel like didn't find differences between their volumes, and it was 12, 18, and 24. They had an effect for time. So again, we can plug these into a meta-analysis, but the data is very much all over the place and inconsistent. And then individually, I think there's issues with these studies that, personally, I just think we need a few well-designed, large studies with control groups. And I think that would be more powerful than the current meta we could do with the current data that we have. And you might disagree, and I think that's fair. But we're replicating the Schoenfeld study now, and my goal, and it's going to be hard. It's these studies are not easy to do. My goal is to double the sample size. So I want 20 to 25 people per group, but then I want a control group to see how stable is my measurement over, that 8 weeks time. And I think if more labs get motivated to do these things, and, it's just, I think it's in a premature state. When you look at the actual amount of studies that are studying these high volumes that people are talking about, there isn't a lot, right? And, to Menno's original point about the magnitude of the growth, yeah, I think that magnitude of growth is particularly impressive. And, I think I was talking to Holly last night, and I said, it's lightning in a bottle. 0.7 at the mean change. If you could capture that twice, if you could capture that two times, like if 0.7 is possible over 8 weeks, does that mean a trained person can grow 1.5 centimeters over 16 weeks, right? Because these aren't newbie gains. They should be getting a somewhat, I don't think there's a consistent rate of gains. I think there's largely a plateau. But if you're trained and you get 0.7, could you do an additional 8 weeks and get 0.7? And, the way my mind works, I just picture that. And this is kind of funny, but I use it as an example in class. So if you guys don't mind.
Are you going to pull out the pastrami?
Not pulling out the bologna. So, Steve, do you guys have Lunchables?
Is this sexual innuendo or?
No, not that bologna.
Yeah, we have Lunchables.
Okay, so I was trying to find a good illustration for class because I'm a teacher, and I don't know if I'm a particularly good teacher, but I certainly try. So my idea was I went to Publix and I got a bologna Lunchable, and because I suspected that one slice of bologna was around what you should expect over 8 weeks time. So one little slice of bologna is a little over the average change in muscle thickness that I would expect to see over 8 weeks, right? It's a little over 2 millimeters or 0.2 centimeters. So 3 slices would be around 0.6. When you look at that thickness, if you imagine your muscle getting that much thicker in 8 weeks, that's really impressive. So that's how my mind works. I picture this, right? I picture my quad is now this much thicker. Now at the group level, if you're 0.7 centimeters thicker, your jeans are tighter. You probably need to buy new pants. But then when I called it lightning in the bottle, if you could do this in 8 weeks, if you could replicate it over an additional 8 weeks, you're the whole stack of bologna in the Lunchable. And I think we would all agree that this might be the growth we'd hope to achieve over a lifetime of training, right? That's a very big difference. This difference here, and I'm holding up bologna on a podcast. This is the end of my career, right? But this change here, just to give some perspective, And I pulled up my bodybuilding case study. The difference between my bicep size right now and Samson Dowda's bicep size is a little bit less than this, right? I'm making myself sound like I'm giant, but that's just because, again, in my mind, I picture muscle that way. I picture it in the thickness of the tissue, right? And so again, this paper is meant to give people the ability to more critically think about these things. And it doesn't mean that that's not possible, but it does mean that we should replicate it, because I believe there could be swelling, there could be inflammation, because we're interpreting these studies under certain premises and assumptions. The assumption is we don't have a lot of swelling because swelling doesn't accumulate across a training study. Well, that's true when you're doing 3 or 4 sets per training session. Is it still true when you're doing 12 sets, when you're doing 15 sets, or you're doing 20 sets per training session? Maybe it is.
And
I don't
then
know if it
can I
is.
jump in, Sam? I've got a question for you, or maybe Josh or Menno can speak to this. When it comes to measuring swelling in this, post-training setting, so whether it's 42 hours and 72 hours, how much evidence do we have for muscle swelling in volumes greater than, say, 25 or 26 sets per week? Maybe you can speak to that. I don't know the answer to this. In fact, Sam and I have many discussions about, should we be doing some more research on, these short acute studies? What kind of swelling are we seeing? And then does that extrapolate to, the longer term? Once we've seen some more of those general adaptations take place, does it stick around? So maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, I'll jump in here because I think my answer to this kind of overlaps with another point that I think is worth mentioning here, and that's the difference between absolute and relative changes. So the direct answer to your question, Holly, is that there is an absence of evidence in terms of investigating bouts of training that are very high volume. And I agree. I think that is something that should be done. We don't have the answer to. My reading of the research we have, I feel pretty good that 72 hours, like 48 to 72 hours is just that, pretty good. I think 96 hours would probably be pretty good. In some of our research that we will start data collection on soon, we plan to do additional measurements after the fact as well to see, like, does this hang around for an additional week? So I think that is a great point. However, we do have research kind of looking at untrained folks doing a novel stimulus, or even trained folks doing a novel stimulus. And that is essentially like an infinite relative increase in terms of the training stimulus. And some of those studies lead me to believe, kind of inform that, hey, I think 96 hours is pretty dang good. 48 to 72 hours is pretty good. But it would be helpful to have some additional evidence at these very high volumes. So again, the relative change here is important, both in terms of swelling. I also think the relative change when contextualizing the results of the Schoenfeld study are also very important as well. So this isn't like all of the exercise science research, but and this was inspired by Sam's paper. And again, I think that was a huge benefit of the paper in the sense of, hey, it gets people like me to look at this deeper and to better contextualize these things and talk about them. I basically pulled all of the studies with multiple groups with varying levels of training volume, and that measured muscle thickness and used trained subjects. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 studies that kind of met that inclusion criteria. And the average absolute change is basically exactly what Holly and Sam said. It was 0.217 centimeters. So yeah, right around that. I think you mentioned 0.14 or 0.2. So yeah, right around that mark. I don't know how many baloney that is, but right around 0.2 centimeters. But it's important to keep in mind that having done these ultrasound measurements myself and also analyze them myself, there are multiple steps that can make what one lab does a little bit different to what another lab does, right? In terms of, like, you have to actually calibrate on ImageJ, which is a software, how many pixels basically makes up a centimeter on the software, right? And if you're measuring the quads, right? If you're going from superficial to deep, are you just looking at the vastus lateralis, or are you looking at an additional muscle as well? So that's why it's important to look at the relative changes, because if you have a high absolute change, that could just be explained by the fact that you're looking at a relatively large chunk of muscle, if you will, between the bone or the deep aponeurosis and the superficial aponeurosis. So anyway, if we kind of convert that average of 0.217 centimeters into a relative change for all of these effects, and to be clear, this isn't just 8 effects. This is all the effects across those 8 studies, which is about 45 effects. So a decent bit of data here. The average percent change is also a number I've heard you hear before, Sam. So right on the money, basically 4.96%, which checks out, I think, to all of us. And then you look at the Schoenfeld outcomes, and the Schoenfeld, it had 4 measures of muscle thickness in the highest volume group. It had elbow flexor muscle thickness, elbow extensor muscle thickness, mid thigh muscle thickness, and lateral thigh muscle thickness. And those ranged from 5.5% increases to 13.7% increases. And I think the kind of outcomes in question here are the 2 thigh muscle thickness measurements, and those were 12.5% and 13.7% respectively. And what I'll say is that's not an isolated finding. It is on the higher side. And like Menno said, there has to be a highest percentage in improvement. But there's a study, and I'm probably going to butcher the lead author here, Amir Thalengam. I believe that's the German volume study. That saw like 10.7% increase. All 3 of the groups in the Aube study saw increases in the distal anterior thigh muscle thickness, which is a pretty similar measurement to the Schoenfeld one, kind of in that 9.7 to 13% range. And probably what I think is most important here is I plotted all of these like 45-ish effects on a histogram. So the relative or percentage increases in muscle thickness on a histogram, and it looks like a normal distribution. And again, the Schoenfeld one is, has 2 of the highest outcomes. So that definitely is interesting. And I think that, warrants replication. Absolutely. We're doing a volume study in our lab right now and have some planned as well. We definitely need more research. But I guess the point here is that these outcomes don't raise any red flags necessarily to me. It fits kind of within some of the other studies we have. We see a normal distribution in terms of these relative effects when kind of pooling all these volume studies together with relatively similar methodology. And lastly, and I think this is important to internalize, is that when you have an extreme effect from a extreme intervention, that also should cause you to pause and think about why that's the case, because it definitely could be variability, random chance, something weird with the methods. Absolutely. But at the same time, it's important for and this is more so for the listener, I know everyone here is aware of this, it's important to understand just a tenet of research is randomization. And every single subject that comes into the study has an equal chance of being in the 2 groups or the 3 groups or the 4 groups, right? So theoretically, and I don't see why this wouldn't be the case here, every single group has an equal chance of having some weird effect occur that is not due to the intervention itself. And the fact that we saw this extreme effect in the highest volume condition, the highest volume intervention, is interesting, right? And then you kind of put all the research together and you say, okay, sometimes we see some nominally greater improvements, so slightly greater improvements in the lower volume groups or the moderate volume groups. Okay, there's definitely variability here. Maybe it's due to different muscles, different training statuses, et cetera. Let's put it all together, account for the variability using control groups, which I think is a great point, Sam. And I mentioned this to you through direct message, but we're gonna attempt to kind of contextualize the results of our meta-regressions within the average variance you see in a non-training control group, which I think is very important. And that randomization ultimately, again, allows all these groups to have the same chance for an outlier or kind of a weird outcome like this. Same idea with the A-mode ultrasound. I don't know a ton about A-mode ultrasound. I've never done scans with A-mode or analyzed them. But theoretically, in that Brigado study, all of the groups have the same chance of having a weird outcome in terms of analyzing the A-mode ultrasound. And variability should ideally be accounted for within the statistical analyses themselves. So I just think that's important to mention is, okay, we see extreme intervention, we see an extreme outcome, but that extreme outcome still fits within a normal distribution, and doesn't, at least from my perspective, doesn't raise any red flags, but definitely warrants replication because, there's always uncertainty and, there's always more questions than answers. So that's kind of my perspective on where those results fit into the body of research.
I enjoyed that, Josh. If I could butt in, the first thing I'll say is with the Brigado, if AMO's ultrasound isn't valid, then regardless of if it's randomized, I do not think that data is going to tell us anything meaningful. But I've been thinking about this recently. Because I've had people comment like, you got to express it as a relative change, and they say, as a relative change, you should expect a certain percent increase in muscle size. And let's just pretend you always expect an 8% increase in muscle size. And because you're bigger, that change is going to be bigger. This implies that as you grow, you should expect more growth, right? So as you go from a 4-centimeter bicep to a 5-centimeter bicep, and we have expectations of a certain percent increase, I think this, and I'm really interested to see more about your analysis, but again, I'm just trying to wrap my mind around physiologically, as you grow, right? As you go from a person that's never trained to a person that's really trained to a person that's ultra trained, there should be a plateauing of your muscle growth, and there should be a slowing of your muscle growth to the point where gaining an additional baloney, I guess that's our new illustration, is going to take a long time, and it may not even be possible. So I struggle with the idea that just because a muscle is bigger, it should grow more. Especially if it's in the context of, someone's growth journey, right? The larger my muscles grow, the less likely I am to see a large magnitude of growth. I think that's just a general concept of adaptation, right? If my quads used to be 5 and now they're 6 centimeters, I don't now expect to see more magnitude of growth because they're now bigger. I still expect to see a less magnitude of growth because I'm more trained and I'm closer to my genetic ceiling. So I still find it interesting, and I think we could probably talk for a few hours just on this idea. But I think there's more to uncover there because there's the analytical approach and view of it, but then there's the physiological, like let's unwrap this physiologically and think about it. And I don't necessarily think just because a muscle is bigger that it should grow more. I think it could grow more, and I think maybe if you take an untrained group, like untrained individuals, maybe the people with larger muscles have the greater capacity to grow. Maybe they have more muscle fibers, right? But if you're taking trained people, and this is another thing that's fascinated me within the literature itself, is in my experience, and I don't know how many training studies I've done at this point. It's quite a few, but when I recruit untrained people, I have a lot more confidence that we're going to get skeletal muscle growth. When I recruit resistance trained individuals, it's obviously much more difficult to have confidence that you're going to have meaningful growth in your study. And I always tell the individuals that come in, they say, hey, are we going to grow if we sign up for your study? I say, well, if you can grow, I'm pretty confident that our protocol will help you to grow. I don't think everybody, one of the first things I tell my class, especially my graduate students, in strength and conditioning is, a lot of you spend 2 hours a day in the gym, and you're just in the maintenance season. I don't, if you've been training for 10 years, I don't think you're growing anymore, right? So when you recruit trained people, and I'm going to snowball on a completely different idea because I think it's interesting, and I hope you guys think it's interesting. When you recruit trained people, and this is funny, when you read a study and train people, they grow. Why do they always grow? I think this represents a phenomenon that's not repeatable, and I don't think you could extrapolate it much beyond the study intervention. So if I recruit a bunch of trained people and I blast their biceps will grow, let's say somewhere around 0.2, right? But if I train them for another 8 weeks, I don't think they're going to grow 0.2 again. And if I train them for another 8 weeks, I don't think they're going to grow for another 0.2. That would be an impossibility, right? Growth is not linear, and that would be amazing gains. So a research study is a snapshot. That's a really interesting thing because people, I think, and this is just a hypothesis, I think it represents a hyper-focused moment, right? So Josh, if you come in and you're signing up for my bicep study and you're just focusing a little bit more intentionally than you normally are in your training, I think, let's say your biceps, we'll give you a good one here, 5 centimeters, right? But your bicep used to be 4, now it's 5. At the end of my study, it's 5.2, right? I think you can maintain that 5.2, but I think it's going to be too difficult. You're going to go back to your normal training. Your biceps going to return to 5. You're still training. You're training, 3 times a week, twice a week on your biceps, 52 sets, depending on who you ask, right? And your muscle kind of returns to where it was. It's a grown muscle, right? It's hypertrophied and it's close to its limit. You could sign up for my study again and you do my 8-week study. We're hyper-focused. We're really getting good stimulus and you go back to 5.2. So this is just my own crazy thoughts. I think a lot of the resistance training literature is capturing this little fluctuation that you can squeeze out of your muscles temporarily. But I think we have to be careful about extrapolating it because, again, extrapolate any study and replicate that growth just 3 times. And it's too much growth to be realistic. Anybody have thoughts on that one? So that's an idea I haven't published yet, but I think it's a pretty fascinating one that I think about quite a bit.
I'd love to speak to that just from the practical sense. And I'm sure you guys have done this yourselves in your own training. But I think, you make a really good point about this idea of like focused periods of training. And, we've heard about it on previous podcast episodes that Steve's had with other guests on where, these people are coming into the lab setting and they're getting one-on-one coaching, support, encouragement on every single rep. And they're being told to get as close to failure or if not to failure. And they're getting really great outcomes. And, you can apply that outside of the gym. And I think there are a lot of people that do a really good job at that. Some people are more focused than others. And again, I think of this in the context of my own training. I've definitely been able to apply that level of focus for, short periods of time. And I would say, I might do like 2 6-week training blocks, 2 mesocycles, and I'm able to exude that kind of effort at those kinds of higher training volumes. And I might get some really good outcomes. But very shortly after that, I am really starting to hit the fatigue physically and mentally. So I don't know that it's necessarily feasible for us to, let's say these kinds of growth outcomes are realistic. Maybe we get a few more, larger study sample sizes coming through that do start to show that, with greater training volumes, we can expect to observe, 0.6 to 0.7 centimeters of growth over this short 8 to 12 week time span. But how long are you able to sustain that? And what happens when you do take the deload or you do back off on your training volumes and you go from the 35 or 30 sets per muscle group per week back down to something that's just, I can breathe now. I've got a career. I have a life. I can't keep pushing at that magnitude. So I think that's a really interesting point that you make, Sam, about, potentially having these focused periods where you can get that extra growth, but maybe it just looks like a bit of a roller coaster. And what we're seeing or capturing in the literature are just the peaks of, these training cycles. So I'd really love to see, what this actually looks like in the real life setting, maybe over like a 12-month time span. But Menno, Josh, I'd love to hear from you guys too.
Yeah, I have a number of points about that. As a researcher who also funds a lot of the research, I'm acutely aware of the difference between labs, and I think some of that might also explain the results of Schoenfeld. I like working with Brad Schoenfeld and Mike Roberts, for example, because I know that their labs have relatively dedicated individuals that sign up for their studies, and they push them really hard. So they have qualified coaches, and also they motivate them like it's someone shouting in your ear while you're lifting. So when you combine better coaching, which has been documented multiple studies to increase gains, plus more motivated subjects, which of course is going to increase gains, plus generally good study design and the like, you also have labs that in general get higher outcomes than other labs. And if we compare that, for example, with the AUBA study, training experience is another big factor. Like we are in a very unfortunate spot with exercise science that we want to do studies on not untrained individuals, because then the results might not apply to trained individuals, but we also don't want to do studies on elite lifters so much because they're probably not going to grow. And it is true that in many studies, people do not grow, actually. There's the Hoffman study, there's the Werkhausen study, I think. And I think there's also a well-documented effect of publication bias, that studies that do find effects are more likely to get published than studies that are just like, oh yeah, we tried this and turns out there was no difference at all. So I don't know. And that might, in this case, actually be somewhat of a good thing. Usually it's negative, but otherwise we might also be flooded in exercise science with null findings. Might be good though, because in a meta-analysis, you should be able to control for that. But in the Aube study, for example, the subjects were squatting over 2 plates or not 2 plates, over twice body weight on average. That's significantly more trained than in many of the other studies. So it makes sense that they find lower outcomes than in the other studies. So that's a few factors between labs that can influence results. And I think almost all of these factors favor Schoenfeld's lab. Swelling is definitely another factor. Before I get into that, there's, I think, another difference that's worth going into. There's a difference between the validity of the absolute results. Like I said earlier, with effect sizes, you cannot look at a single study and get much from that. But even with A-mode ultrasound or a very surprising, almost incredible effect sizes, the probability of observing these results by chance can still be quite low. So even if you use A-mode ultrasound instead of B or MRI, the results, I think, are still at least somewhat valid, less valid than MRI, but still somewhat valid, because it's unlikely that just because of the error of A-mode ultrasound, you would get that lower, medium, high exactly in that order where you get a dose response curve, even if, again, not all of these differences are significant between groups. So I think these studies, they still add value, just less value than a better controlled study. I agree, by the way, about Sam, what you said about a really good big study actually having even more weight than a meta. And if you're going to run that study, it would be amazing. For most labs, it's just not doable to get that many trained individuals. So I would be happy to collaborate with you and help you fund it as well, because I know how difficult it is to do that. And if you also want a control group, yeah, you're asking for a lot. And again, I think it would be amazing if we or you can make that work.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah. Last point, swelling. Swelling is definitely a factor. I think in large part, I agree with Josh's points there. Most studies wait 48 to 72 hours. That's probably a little bit too short, especially the ANUS study, because they were increasing the volume. But in the studies that were not increasing the volume and at least 8 weeks of duration, like Radeli, Schoenfeld, Brigato, I think it's less of an issue, because we have very well documented the fact that the swelling and the muscle damage and the soreness dramatically decreases from the first time you have the stimulus to repeated stimulus in habitually, or it becomes an habitual stimulus in trained individuals. So A, trained individuals, and B, doing a workout that they are familiar with, that they've done many times before. Then you get a whole lot less swelling than if you have an untrained individual that for the first time in his or her life is subjected to eccentric exercise, and then they have like a week of swelling, right? So based on, I wrote a post relatively, maybe a year ago now on Instagram, where I kind of reviewed this literature and also concluded kind of the same as Josh, that 42 to 72 is quite good. It's to the extent that I would find it unlikely that all of the difference between groups would be explained by swelling, but it's probably still a confounder. And indeed, I would like 72 to 96, probably 96 hours would be much nicer for these studies, especially in like the NS study where you're increasing the volume, because then every time it's kind of a new stimulus for people. And the total volume is quite ridiculous. We have some studies, mostly in untrained individuals, but some in trained individuals, where you have like 10 sets for one muscle group. And then you typically see in trained individuals that it's not too bad. There are actually, I think, 2 studies where they find that when it's an habitual stimulus, up to 10 sets per workout doesn't induce significant swelling anymore after 48 hours. Now, these studies have higher volumes. So, and of course, different exercises can do different amounts of muscle damage. So I definitely agree. It's a confounder. I think studies should extend the duration more to the 96-hour mark. But based on the current evidence, I would find it very unlikely that we happen to get that exact trend just from swelling.
Yeah, to kind of second that, I think, again, from my reading of the research, swelling is unlikely to kind of compound throughout a training study or accumulate throughout a training study. I would say like the worst case scenario, if you will, in terms of swelling would be an increase that stays the same throughout the training study. Or probably what's more likely is it increases when it's a novel stimulus and then it drops off. And that's why I agree with, I think, kind of a consensus here that I think it would be smart to bump those ultrasound exams back a little bit. Now, there are logistical limitations to that, right? Now you need subjects maybe coming in the next week, right? And Sam, you might be nodding your head there because I know you're probably aware of those kind of logistical limitations. But yeah, my general stance is I think the dose response we do see could be confounded by swelling, but I would be very, very surprised if it explained the dose response to a large degree. It could kind of overstate the dose response. I'm definitely open to that. I don't think we have the evidence to say either way. But again, from my kind of from extrapolating from what we do have, my opinion is that it's unlikely to explain it to a large extent. And that's important practically to Holly and Sam's points, because ultimately this whole discussion is sort of around maximizing gains. And there's a big difference between some or meaningful gains and optimal gains, right? And especially when you put that within the context of, like Holly said, a full-time job or let alone training your entire body, right? Which wasn't the case in the Ennis study, or at least like the posterior chain muscles were at a lower training dose. A couple other points that are slightly related, and this was a little bit ago, but to follow up on your point, Sam, about you wouldn't expect a larger muscle to see a greater relative increase in terms of folks that are more advanced. I absolutely agree with that. I think you might have been the lead author on a paper as like skeletal muscle growth to infinity and beyond, or at least a co-author perhaps. Yeah, lead author, I think. That's a fantastic paper.
Co-author, Brittany Counts was the lead author on that paper. She did a great job.
Yeah, like I absolutely agree. I would not expect a more trained individual to see a greater relative gain. More so what I'm getting at is just when you have a larger absolute muscle, if you will, or if you're looking at two quad muscles versus one quad muscle, right? Not necessarily the advancement of the training cohort. So that's kind of a side note. But I do think it's important to take a step back, and I acknowledge and agree with a lot of the points made regarding the limitations of research in general in short-term training studies. But I do think it's important for the listener to recognize that this is a problem with all training studies and not just the volume research. The swelling stuff might apply disproportionately to the volume research, but it also applies to proximity to failure research, perhaps blood flow restriction training or different rep ranges. And then the limitations in terms of, okay, these trained people see meaningful growth that we know is just not sustainable. Again, that is a limitation of exercise science training studies in general. And the way that I think about it is, that applies to both groups, kind of getting back to the randomization and the equal likelihood of random kind of false positives to pop up. So as a practitioner, I'm going to hedge my bets to these training studies, even though they're limited, to the ones that show larger effects, even if it's not unanimous. But again, putting that within context of, again, training the entire body, fitting within the individual schedule, all those kind of practical constraints. And then on that point of, we see trained people see growth that is arguably unsustainable. I almost take the opposite perspective in the sense that I'm interested in how we can leverage that phenomenon in practice, as opposed to why perhaps we should put less weight in the studies in general. And as I mentioned, the topic I'm interested in for my PhD is skeletal muscle resensitization, which kind of circles around this specialization type of approach. Now, we don't have much, arguably, no evidence in this area, but that's part of the reason I'm interested in this area, is because, okay, we see some of these more extreme effects in the more extreme volume studies, but we also know that's probably not sustainable, especially if training all muscle groups. So what if we take sort of a volume cycling approach? And perhaps you return to baseline after that specialization approach. I'm definitely open to that possibility, but I kind of doubt it. It's not like in the detraining studies where you basically have a higher volume period followed by a reduced volume period. It's not like you see a drop off in muscle size in many of those studies. I think you would probably be able to maintain it. Now, perhaps swelling is contributing a bit, and perhaps it does attenuate when that muscle group is no longer kind of the focus. But I would expect from the detraining research, or probably more accurately, the reduced training volume research or the maintenance volume research, I would expect that to be something that can be sustained. And then the last point I'll say is, yeah, like we definitely see some well-trained people in our lab grow a lot, like even visually so. You're like, oh my gosh, those are the same quads as they were 8 weeks ago. You look like a totally different person. We've had people come in that can squat 500 plus, and by the end of the study, again, their quads look visually different. Who's to say why that's the case? There's a lot of possibilities. We also see people that can squat 500 plus and they get weaker and they don't grow, right? And I'm, a lot of people on the internet would kind of say like, hey, we want as high of training status as possible. But to your point, Sam, sometimes I question that, right? Because if you don't see any growth at all, it's hard to find any differences between the interventions. So it's kind of a balancing act there for sure. But yeah, lots of unknowns. And ultimately, I guess the main point here is the limitations of exercise science training studies. A lot of them apply to all studies. And secondly, perhaps some of the limitations can be leveraged in practice, i.e. perhaps like a sort of specialization approach.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I don't know if I was just going to... Sam, did you have a point you wanted to make? Sorry.
Yeah,
Go for it.
I guess I was going to start with the training status one. I think one of the things that's important in research, and one of the things that my lab does, is when we recruit people, we want to call them trained. If we're doing a bicep curl study, you have to be training your biceps and doing bicep curls. Because if this movement's new to you, I expect novel adaptation. If we're doing a knee extension study and it's required for you to have trained quads, I want you performing knee extension inside. So we've made our criteria as specific as we can make them to ensure, like, I'm mostly interested in muscle growth, right? Which is going to be different than strength adaptations. You need the specificity of the movement for strength as well. But I generally try to make our studies a bit more specific to tease out that training status. And then when you do, yeah, you're still going to see people that respond remarkably. And then when that happens, there's, okay, how in the world did this just happen, right? How did a person grow this much? This is unusual. They might just be gifted, right? I think Holly's gifted. She grows like crazy in her training protocols, and I'm doing the same thing, and I'm looking the same. But I think training status, I've written a paper on this, but I think making a statement of resistance training for at least 6 months is so vague. Like, what are you doing? we did so we conducted a year-long study. It's not published yet. We have about 30 people we tracked across an entire year. And we just tracked their biceps, and they had to be training their biceps before signing up. They had to be doing bicep curls before they signed up. And then we tracked their growth across the year, and they had to be doing at least 3 sets at least twice a week. So they had to be stimulating the biceps. And we collected training logs, and over an entire year at the mean change in muscle thickness was not significant. There was no growth. Now our average training age was about 8 years. So they were pretty trained people. But we had people in there with 1, 2, 3, 4 years. So there's a lot of variability. But when we looked at the data, and you got to be careful interpreting individual data, our control group's pretty small. But I think, and this is where my hypothesis on 8-week study represents a limited phenomena, you'll see little peaks along the way. All right. But across the year, there's moments where you measure them and it's going to look like they grew. Measure them again, they look like, they're back down. So I think once you're grown, I think you fluctuate around. It's like peaking for a bodybuilding show, perhaps, right? You're trying to push as hard as you can, make your muscles as large as they can be, but I don't think it's a sustainable thing necessarily. 98% of it can be sustained. It's that extra bit, the bit that I believe we're capturing in studies. And part of the reason I thought that is our year-long training study, which I hope we get out soon. The next thing I wanted to talk about, what did I write here? I can't read that at all. Something bias. Maybe it'll come back to me. But I don't know what that was. With the swelling, you guys covered a lot of different things. But I'll tell you, the reason that I'm putting the suggestion of swelling out there, I contributed to the literature suggesting that swelling doesn't accumulate across a training week. In 2016 European Journal of Applied Physiology, we tried to make swelling accumulate, and it does not accumulate across a training week. There's an initial swelling, and there's maybe a baseline shift in the muscle size, but it's not prolonged and it doesn't accumulate. And that's in untrained people doing 4 sets of bicep curls 3 times a week. And then you have the Philippe Damas paper that looked at echo intensity as an indicator of swelling. And I have my issues with echo intensity with, for those that are listening and don't know echo intensity, you basically take an ultrasound image and you look at the color in the ultrasound image. So you look for darkness and lightness in the image, and it's supposed to tell you about the fluid. Well, what we found is when you tilt the ultrasound probe just a little bit, you get a drastic change in echo intensity, no change in muscle thickness. So echo intensity may not be the best measure. But in that study, they suggested that the first 3 weeks, echo intensity is going crazy, and thereafter, it seems to calm down. So, I mean, I'm not saying that could be leveraged in the NS study to suggest that since they increased volume, maybe they reintroduced this swelling. I don't know that I believe that. It's possible. But the reason I brought up swelling is, to me, it's the best explanation, right? So, and again, this is just my perspective. When I see extraordinary growth that I can't wrap my head around, growth that I know cannot happen twice, lightning in a bottle, my mind thinks about it and I go, okay, do I think this difference between groups could lead to this difference in muscle growth? I don't think so. The next best thing is swelling. So it's not because I think there's great evidence for swelling. We don't have that evidence. We don't know. But I think swelling is a better explanation than some of these muscle growths being possible. And that's both from a magnitude of muscle change perspective, but it's also from a physiological perspective. The fact that I don't think, the final volume, and again, I'm using the NS study to demonstrate my thinking, and this thinking is applied to how I read all studies. But with the NS study, right, 22 sets split between 2 sessions means 4 sets of squats, 4 sets of leg press, and 3 sets of knee extension. I don't know that 5 is better than 4. That 6 is better than 4, right? So if physiologically, I don't think adding sets to something that's already sufficient would cause growth, then the next best explanation to and it's not even significant, right? It's nearing, and we kind of ran with it because I think we have this pre-existing knowledge that, okay, volume should do this. But since I can't wrap my head around a situation where we're not just pouring too much water in a cup that can't hold all of it, and magically it leads to more growth, right? So my best rationale in that situation is, I think it's probably swelling, because physiologically, I don't think you're getting greater muscle protein synthesis from doing what I think is kind of an obnoxious amount of volume. I think it's interesting that they looked at it. I think it's really cool that they did it, right? But I'm not compelled to think that that's an inherently more anabolic protocol, at least the way the volume was distributed. If they gave an extra day and they gave variety of exercise, then I think it could be a little bit more interesting for me, because I think if you disperse your volume amongst different movements which hit your fibers in different ways, I think maybe there's a greater likelihood of getting maybe more growth, right? That's why people do flat bench, they have incline, they have decline, they have flies, right? We have different movements that work the same muscle group, but we're not, you do 3 movements for chest. You don't do the same movement and put all your sets on that same movement, because we assume that different exercises are stressing our fibers in a different way that's going to lead to some different type of growth, with obviously some redundancies. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that the swelling to me is just the best explanation in some of these circumstances. And it's not that I think there's great evidence for swelling, but I think as an explanation, it's the one that makes the most sense to me, because the other explanation, if I don't think that growth is possible, then I think it's swelling. If it's not swelling, it could be, okay, were they unblinded? Was there some inherent bias in taking the measurement that was unintentional, but it can happen. Especially if you think, I think this group should be better, right? And we should be blinded to our measurements, and that shouldn't happen. But that's why I prefer to think it's swelling, because I don't think it's growth. And the last thing, I just want to mention this because Menno talked about Brad's group, and I think they do great work, and I think they've had a lot of great people come through that lab. But this is just more of a personal thing, because when people disagree with me, since they don't know me and I'm not on social, I mean, I'm on social media, but I'm not posting my physique updates, right? So sometimes I get portrayed as a white coat scientist, or, my mentor, Jeremy Lenicky, I remember when people would disagree with him, instead of debating the science, they would just post a picture of his haircut. And I make fun of his haircut, so I can say that. He's a powerlifter and he's a bodybuilder. And I think he would admit he was average at both of those things, maybe below average as a bodybuilder, but he's very strong. And, just because you picture someone as a white coat scientist doesn't mean they are. I think most people that are studying muscle growth were obsessed with training just like I am, right? So, I heard a podcast. It was during my PhD, and a pretty well-known person. He was making fun of one of our papers. And he goes, I'm pretty sure these guys have never lifted a weight in their lives. I was like, well, you have no idea what we do, right? We're just not public figures. So it's not your knowledge to what I do. So I just think, sometimes different labs, just because we're not public figures, are perceived a certain way. But, when I go to academic conference and I get together with people that do resistance training research, they typically are lifting enthusiasts. They love lifting. They love talking about it. And so I think, and they know how to train hard. And I think sometimes that perception gets out there, but every single lab I've worked in and been in has people that just love training and are pretty decent at it. So
I couldn't agree more. I mean, we were talking a bit about study design, and one way to contextualize the findings is using a non-training control. Another way to do that is to do a crossover study. So right now we're in progress of a within subjects crossover study. This is Zach Robinson, who I know you know, Steve, his dissertation research. The reason I bring that up is it's we're at the tail end of it, but the amount of work that goes into a crossover study with a decent sample size is a lot. And just speaking for my lab mates, right? The only reason people are in there pushing these subjects hard every day, and our subjects training with us for almost a year, is because everyone in there loves lifting And again, that's just speaking for our lab. I know that's the case in almost every other lab out there. So very much agree with that sentiment there. One thing that I think is interesting on the swelling front, I think we're kind of all on the same page that there's an absence of evidence here. One thing is like to kind of hypothesize is what do we expect the kind of dose responsive swelling to be? Because I think it would have to be linear or almost exponential to explain most of the findings. This is acute swelling, but there's a study from Marchetti, I think it's from last year or the year before. They looked at 4 to 16 sets of acute, I think it was bicep curls, and the acute swelling measured from ultrasound was almost the exact same. So kind of indicating that, at least in this design, that the acute swelling did not seem to be impacted by the amount of volume. Now, the mechanisms for chronic swelling in the following days or perhaps even weeks is probably a different mechanism. But perhaps it's something, and the fluid would have to get there in the first place. So I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but I do think when thinking about the volume research in the absence of a ton of swelling research, it might be helpful for the listener to consider what the dose response relationship is between additional sets and swelling. I would suspect it's diminishing returns, and thus that kind of informs my position that the additional sets are leading to additional hypertrophy. It could be some additional swelling, but it's unlikely to explain a large chunk of it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Sam, and kind of given we have an absence of evidence.
Yeah, I do think we just currently don't have the evidence. I think prolonged swelling is probably going to be different than acute swelling. So if we ran 2 protocols and looked at the immediate response, I don't know that I expect large differences. The craziest swelling I've ever seen post-exercise is from my dissertation, and it was going with very low load training, but we did 90 reps per set with 15% of 1RM. That blew up the muscle like you wouldn't believe, and it was there for a while. In fact, the hallmark of knowing that people signed up for my study is they walked around like their arm was in a sling because they couldn't extend their arms all the way. So with like extreme protocols, we've seen extreme swelling. But that was a low load, 90 reps per set for 4 sets. So that's 3 minutes of continuous exercise 4 times. That's 12 minutes of exercise. That did something I had never seen before. So again, have we looked at these 52 sets? What would the 45 sets do? I don't know. And I also, like you mentioned, I think they're different things, perhaps. There's neutrophil infiltration into the muscle cell 24 to 48 hours after. So what is that doing? And is that leading to a delayed swelling that we need to try to account for with these higher volumes? I don't know. But I will say that our replication study, we have designed in it, we're doing post-testing the way that it was done, and then 3 to 5 days later, we're doing post-testing a second time. It's a pain in the butt, and it means we go on vacation a little bit later, even though our semester's over, but it's important because, we raise this criticism, so we want to make it better by trying to account for it. Is it perfect? No. But what if we do see like the same changes, but then those changes are just a little bit less, after they come back 3 days later? So, we're doing what we can through study design, and, I'm really interested unfortunately, it's going to be a while because I have a very tiny lab space and recruiting people is tough. But the study's going really well, and I can't wait for, us to get this data. But I don't want my lab to be the last lab to do this. I want other labs to begin investigating these things as well. I think too often, just the certain ideas are only pursued by the same group, and we all have our different, methodologies. We have our different biases. And I think we get a better idea with diversity of lab groups pursuing these things. But yeah, with the swelling, I don't know is the short answer, but I've seen extreme swelling as well, just not in the context of high load training. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think this discussion's been really good. I'm trying to think of a way of trying to summarize it to some extent, or at least I'm going to just add some thoughts here and see if there's anything that people want to follow up on. It's kind of coming to that number 4 point within your paper is like, is this muscle growth possible? And the question of swelling. And obviously, I think there are some reasons why people might grow more than maybe we would expect, because it's like potentially a specialization, potentially the lab effect, having people kind of shouting at you, like having a training partner almost. That can lead to better results. Can it lead to this level of results? That's something that we remain skeptical about, which is fair. And I think everyone here is under the impression that swelling could have played a role. I think maybe there's different opinions on how much of a role it could have played. I know with the Enos et al. Study, they were kind of adding, in that last week, it would have been either 6 additional sets that they had the week before at the 52, or they're at 42 and they had 4. So that kind of had that increasing set volume, whereas with Brad's, they were kind of that static set volume that was just high for the extended period of time, I believe, whereas Enos was kind of unique in terms of adding those sets. So it's a little bit different in terms of the impact of swelling, maybe on Brad's versus on the kind of Enos paper there. I don't know if that brings about any thoughts, but it's whether or not I think trying to pass, does that relationship still hold? Are those results still valuable to add to the body of evidence of there's a dose response relationship there? It's just not as, because the swelling is leading to like an additional look upon it. And is that swelling the same for maybe the 42 sets versus the 52, or is the 52 getting that much more swelling and that's where that growth is coming from? I don't think we have an answer to it, but I think it's just where everyone's remaining skeptical. I don't know if you remove these papers from kind of the body of literature, where does that leave us? Does it leave us back at this general recommendation we see at 12 to 20 sets still? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts of my general ramble of just listening to you guys go back and forth, which has been brilliant, by the way.
I think, again, I want to jump in just from the practical perspective and say, I don't think that we have all of the answers just yet, but we can certainly make inferences from what we do know. And I think one of the things that I would love to see in terms of, future study design is perhaps some implementation of a more practical program that is being executed in real life settings. So, I think about the types of training that we are prescribing with our clients, and it's typically anywhere from as little as 3 days through to 5 or 6 for some of our more advanced and, invested lifters. And if we think back to all of the studies that we've discussed today, most of these are, either training frequencies of 2 days or 3 days. So, I mean, even that is very different from the way that we might practically recommend or prescribe a training program, let alone how we then distribute those training volumes. So I would even argue that the way that we're doing things practically might actually offer us better opportunities to maybe see some of those, extraordinary findings, at least in my experiences from the growth I've experienced personally. And then I've also seen with clients who are getting, 6 monthly DEXA scans, now arguably not as good as, MRI, CT or ultrasound, that's for sure. But, I have seen some of these types of results, anecdotally through personal experience. So I hope, if anything, it kind of leads us to design better studies, which I think all of us would agree with, that are more realistic for how a practitioner would write. And then maybe control for, some of the swelling, arguments and conversations that we're at least having today. So I think the bigger thing that I kind of want to see if, any of the guys want to share with the listener is, what does this mean when it comes to actually prescribing training program? We're all sitting here, we're listening, we all train, the people listening train. How does what we've talked about today impact what we do, in the gym? So, I mean, I'd love to go through each of the guys, and I can certainly talk to it myself. Okay, what kind of training volumes per week do we each recommend and kind of tend to agree on? How many sets per muscle group per week? And then within the session, are we, in agreement upon, or is there some differences there? What kind of growth outcomes, as a percentage, are we talking 4%? Are we talking 8% over an 8 to 12 week study intervention? And are there some differences for beginners versus, steady state advanced lifters? So maybe we can go through each of us and maybe talk to what would you do when it comes to practically prescribing training, and what do we expect to see? I think keeping in the context of today's discussion, in resistance trained individuals when it comes to absolute or relative changes in muscle growth.
I like that. I was going to suggest the exact same thing, because I know that all the listeners at this point are shouting like you talked for 2 hours, and the answer is we don't know.
Tell us what we need.
I want my money back.
Practical application. Let's go. Menno, you can start. Go for it.
All right, sure. I think the question I was going to phrase it as is if you would have to give like a 95% confidence interval of where the growth would lie for trained individuals that want to absolutely maximize muscle growth, or maybe put otherwise, like more practically, where as a practitioner or for yourself do you mostly put your volume? For me, I've basically given the same answer for the last 5 years or so. Maybe I'm erring to the side of slightly higher, but I think the practical limitations make these volumes simply prohibitive. It's 10 to 30 sets per muscle group per week, and then preferably with a high frequency approach. Again, the trained individuals that are looking to maximize hypertrophy, I think you're in that range. It's a big range, I know. I know people want like 17 is the magic answer, but it's I think the next step for research is going to be first figuring out really where is the average, but also how does this vary when you're bulking versus when you're cutting? How does this vary when you're sleep deprived and you have kids and you have a full-time job versus when you are a student and you have nothing else, or you're a professional athlete and literally all you have to focus on in life is getting these gains, right? So I think it's a big range for a reason, but I would put it at like 10 to 30, and I'm actually quite open to higher volumes in some cases being beneficial. We've seen it now in multiple studies. I think actually as a final point I would give, because we've seen it in like 5 studies, and I know that meta-analysis kind of balance it out after 20 to 30 sets, so that's why I'm capping it at 30. I think actually we are all biased against higher volumes. We simply don't want to believe that these volumes can be productive. I think we all have that. I have it too. And I think that we see that on social media too, in almost everyone. Nobody wants to find out that 50 is the magic answer, because it's just a whole lot of time. And maybe it is true, like we see it in a couple studies. It doesn't seem to practically be the case. It's a hell of a workout. It's going to get you injured. It sucks, but maybe it is simply the truth. And if you look at professional athletes, Olympic gymnasts, Thai fighters, they think if you say, whoa, that's 2 hours per day, they're like, that's half my day, right? They do 4 hours a day. So in that sense, maybe we are all just biased and we're actually going to find out that it's higher. But yeah, very short answer, 10 to 30 sets would be kind of my range.
Menno, with that, can I ask, do you have, I'm guessing that's muscle group, sets per muscle per week, direct sets? Yeah, that's one question. And then do you find more people are closer to the 10 or more muscle groups and people are closer to the 10 than to the 30? How does that look for you? Because I have a similar range, but I have a bias. More is like lower towards 10 versus more being towards 30. But it's obviously there's individual differences.
Right. Yeah. In clients, I definitely earn more towards the 10 than the 30 for numerous reasons, and especially when you factor in recovery capacity and the like. So, and cutting, especially when cutting, it's definitely going to be closer to 10 than 30. And another point actually that Holly mentioned, which is very good, and Sam also, is that I'm a big proponent of high frequency training, and especially with these high volumes, I think it is much more productive when you do it with a high frequency approach. And I would, based on James Krieger's meta-analysis, be very hesitant to go with more than 6 sets per exercise per session. It just becomes hard to fathom how that would indeed stimulate more net muscle protein synthesis and not get into junk volume and very poor stimulus to fatigue ratio stuff, and preferably more like 3 sets per exercise even. What was the second part of your question? Oh yeah, direct volume. Yeah, so that would be a whole another discussion, but I use actually a fractional approach, which I don't necessarily recommend. It's complicated, but I kind of try to figure out based on the research, like, is this 50% stimulus? Is this 80% stimulus? Is this 100% stimulus? And then I weigh every exercise in that way to get to that, 15 sets per muscle group. We know, for example, that biceps curls stimulate approximately double the growth of dumbbell rows. So then double rows in my programs would get a weighing of 50% versus 100% for biceps curls.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't know if Holly, you want to go to your recommendations?
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say, I love that you do the fractional percentages. I know we've just gone through an entire exercise library and basically tried to identify, on basic movements like your squat or single leg squat movements and, what that actually encompasses. Is it what's the primary muscle group? What's the secondary muscle group? What's the tertiary muscle group? And how much weight do we give to that movement? Which of them is actually getting to failure? And then as a percentage, how much of this other muscle group might be getting close to failure? Because, if we think about, working with training intensities, in that rep, RPE 7 through to 10, your glutes in a squat, for instance, and again, depending on, whether you're a forward squatter, low bar squatter or a high bar squatter, it might switch a little bit more to quad emphasis. So I think it's really important when we're prescribing exercises to make sure that we're giving some thought to, what percentage of that movement is also potentially giving some volume, some sets, to this other muscle group. So I love that you think about that, but it's definitely a more complicated way to prescribe programming. I love that you mentioned the context being really important. And I think, how we might prescribe, our weekly training set number and then, session set number probably comes back to, is this person in a caloric deficit? How long have they been dieting? What percentage of their total body weight have they lost? Because all of those things have implications for, how well they're going to tolerate the training. Versus are they in a muscle building phase, whether they're in an energy surplus, so they're in an environment that's going to thrive and potentially have greater, hypertrophy outcomes. So I think, the volume probably needs to give context to, their individual circumstances and goals. You also mentioned a really great point about, hypertrophy specific programming, Steve, versus someone that might also be interested in strength. So, there's many occasions where we're trying to prescribe a program where somebody doesn't want to completely discount strength adaptations. So we've got to be really specific in adding movements that are going to facilitate that goal. But then they also want to know, well, how much can I grow? So then we've got to bring all of these things into the context of the discussion. But to think more broadly, I think for me, I'm probably in a similar rep range as what Menno's described per week. I might set a little bit higher, say 15 sets through to 30 sets for a more advanced resistance trainee versus somebody that's brand new to resistance training. I might be prescribing 6 up to 15 sets as a maximum, when they're first starting, and obviously we progressively increase. When it comes to within session training volume, I'm a proponent of everything that, Sam has said here and Menno and Josh. I don't know that more than, 6 sets on an individual muscle group makes a whole lot of sense. I think, once it's done, it's done. But I do think there's a lot of value in exercise diversity. So again, thinking about the overlap between different movements, I might prescribe, a squat, a deadlift and a lunge and a hip thrust all in the one program, but I'm prescribing them for different reasons. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to get you to do this movement because for that exercise, I want it to be targeting, your quads, whereas this is going to be set and prescribed because it's going to hit your glutes a bit more, but I can't discount that there might be some overlap. So I think there might be cases where you'd count up how many sets, on a particular muscle group within a session. It might be higher than 6, could be 9 or 12. But the reason it's in the program is actually because it's targeting the other muscle, the antagonist muscle group, for instance. So I think we align in that regard. And yeah, I don't know that there's a whole lot more outside of that I need to add. I'd love to hear from Josh and Sam too.
Go for it, Josh.
I'll jump in here and then you could take it home, Sam. First of all, I very much agree with different ways of quantifying set volume or the stimulus that a given muscle is receiving, and that's something we've done our best to hopefully provide some insight on that soon. Same idea with the per session versus weekly volumes. My colleague here at FAU, Jake Remmert, we've kind of been working side by side on this project along with Zach, who I've mentioned before. And yeah, we're excited to hopefully provide insight onto both of those questions because I agree that those are our limitations. Another thing I'll say before I get to the, I guess my take homes is that, and this does tie into the take homes, is that research is, I think we overly focus on ecologically valid research, whereas I think ecologically valid research, so research that represents what is done in practice and thus can arguably be applied more directly to practice, I think is excellent. However, there are sacrifices to ecologically valid research, and that's often at the cost of internal validity, which is basically the extent that the outcomes that you're looking at are due to the differences in intervention, right? So I've kind of shifted my mindset on that over the last probably 5 years, primarily just as a result of getting my hands dirty with research. So, for example, with the Ennis study, I don't think the goal of that research is to tell you how to train or to say that 52 sets per week is, the magic number, or that you should even go up that high at any point, but instead to understand the nature of the relationship. I ultimately think that's the goal of research, is to understand the nature of the nature of the relationship between the independent variable and the outcome of interest, right? That's ultimately what it comes down to. And then once you understand that, like Menno said, maybe there is no point at which you see worse gains, right? Maybe there is. Maybe there's a clear plateau point that will eventually elucidate. I don't know, right? But the goal is not to tell you how to train, but instead to understand the nature of that relationship. And then the individual can make the determination, or the coach can make the determination in terms of that cost benefit analysis, given everything going on in that individual's life and just in their training goals in general. So that's why I'm honestly hesitant to give specific numbers. But at the same time, like, the scientist in me cringes when I think about giving specific numbers. But I also realize, kind of going back to a point I made at the very beginning, that that's helpful to the consumer, right? And the way that I think about it is in terms of levels. So I'm kind of working on this right now, and this very well might change, and the numbers will probably shift as well. But I would kind of say there's like the middle level is where I think most muscles are probably going to see the best results in a sustainable way for most. And I'd probably put that around 6 to 20 sets per week per muscle. That's a very wide range, but I think 6 sets per week can be a very robust stimulus, and might be past the point of diminishing returns for some. But I could also see the argument that it's closer to 20. And again, kind of that cost benefit analysis, layering in the uncertainty in the research, and then the individual circumstances kind of lead to that determination. And then I would also put a level above that and a level below that. So the level below that would be like, 2 to 6 sets, say, or 2 to 5 sets. Low volumes can still grow muscle, right? We're primarily talking about optimization, but maybe it's optimal over the longer term to not always optimize a given muscle or optimize all muscles at the same time. So you can strategically kind of have this like slow burn level that's 1 to 5 sets per week. Most muscles probably around 6 to 20 sets, and then the level above that would be specialization, 21 sets or above, right? And again, these numbers are loose. I don't hold them too tightly, but again, they give a general idea because there's uncertainty in those higher volumes. I fully expect that kind of our credible intervals in our analysis to really open up as you get to higher volumes. So kind of what's future research is likely to kind of fall within. So in other words, we just have less confidence at those higher volumes. But at the same time, we don't have a clear point at which you definitely see a plateau or definitely see worse gains. So it might be worth exploring for some folks, but I would still characterize that as specialization just because of practical considerations that most have. So in short, kind of that lower tier, that's a slow burn that can be very low volume, still can be effective. Most muscles in a 6 to 20 range, and then perhaps some or multiple muscles in kind of a specialization or a higher volume range of north of 20 sets per week.
Excellent. I think that makes a lot of sense there as well. And Sam, I'll leave it with you.
This is probably where they'll tune out. I think I agree with what everyone has said, and like I said at the beginning, I think we're going to mostly agree with just some different nuanced takes on certain things. When people ask me how much volume they should do, and me and Holly have had this conversation more than once, I think about it first. So I'm going to connect science and application experience because I think all three are important. When you walk in the gym, your muscles are in a largely resting state. and your goal is to maximize what you can get out of the exercises that you're doing. So when I think about doing an exercise, I think about, okay, how many sets does it take to maximize the muscle protein synthetic response I can get from this exercise? Within a single exercise, I think within 3 or 4 sets. And the reason I say 3 or 4, Kumar compared 3 versus 6 and looking at the muscle protein synthetic response or markers of protein synthesis, and it was similar in younger individuals. We actually have data in older individuals just like they need more protein than us, they need more volume than us to get the same response. But no one goes in the gym and does one exercise, right? So I tend to tell people, I think 3 to 4 sets, 2 are near failure, and probably 2 to 4 exercises to get variation in the movement and variety of the movement. So you stress the muscle in different ways. James Steele has some interesting work where he looked at exercise variation, right? You don't necessarily need variation in the volume or intensity, but variation in movement might grow the muscle in a different way. So I think 3 to 4 sets per exercise, I maybe 3 to 4 exercises, and this is per session. And then you got to zoom out. Okay, this is what Sam's recommending per session. Well, how does frequency matter? Probably 2 to 3 days per week, right? And this is where science can't answer it because our studies aren't designed this way, right? So think about maximizing the anabolic response you can get in a fiber, in a movement. And then you have to choose how much variation in movement do you want. We had an interesting conversation, me and Holly, about, when you do a chest fly, how much of it is the same fibers being stressed and fatigue as in a bench press, right? There's probably carryover there. So maybe it means that when you do your bench press, when you go to chest fly, you probably need less sets because a lot of those fibers have already been fatigued and they've already been stimulated for a muscle protein synthetic response. And I tend to believe that maximal exists. Some people disagree with this, right? Some people think doing more is always going to provide more. But if you think about adaptation, and I think Henselmans very eloquently gives us at least a rationale here. He called it adaptation energy, right? And he said we all have some capacity to adapt over a given period of time. And what I think that suggests is, you can only acquire so much muscle tissue over a certain period of time because we're an organism that has to regulate a metabolism. We have to regulate all sorts of things. So you're not going to just take the governor off and grow at a crazy rate. You're protecting, like, I think largely we protect ourselves against extreme growth because extreme growth, if all of us on this call could be as big as we wanted to be, we would look like Super Saiyans, right? But oftentimes what I see online and, what I even hear from some scientific communicators is kind of that mentality that it's like an anime. If you just focus and you train hard and you go crazy, you're going to completely transform. But I think our physiology tells a different story. 3 to 4 sets, 2 to 4 exercises, 2 to 3 times per week per muscle group. A listener can do the math. I don't have evidence for this, right? There's limited evidence and studies aren't necessarily designed in this way. But I encourage people when they go into the gym and when you read and consume research, you can't just look at the weekly sets. You have to look at how it's broken down because muscle adapts and this is physiology. And there are principles in physiology that we can apply and we can use them to better inform our training. And that's why I have large skepticism when people are just shoving all the volume into 2 sessions per week. I just don't think it's a good way to look at that stuff. But that probably adds up to somewhere in 20 to 30, I think, which probably actually puts me on the higher end. But I like the insurance policy. And, when I'm giving advice, wouldn't we all want an insurance policy? If this movement produces better growth than that movement, I want both movements in my program. So yeah, I'm rambling, so I'll stop here, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think
like the insurance policy.
Yeah, I think that was well said, and I think many of you have already stated that there's lots of things that go into training volume, like one set of how hard are you training? What exercise are you doing? Are you in a cut? Are you in a mass? Like, where are you nutritionally? How stressful is your lifestyle? Like all of these things. So at least I'm going to tell anyone here can tell me if I'm wrong. I'm going to assume all of you generally recommend people start at the lower end of things, see how they're responding to that, and then think about, okay, if I'm recovering easily, this feels very doable, my performance is fine, then progressing higher and see how you do. And I talk about auto-regulation all the time, and this is something I find incredibly valuable with clients, is like looking at their performance across sets, within sessions, session RPE, what is that kind of stimulus within an exercise and session, like that pump disruption, soreness and fatigue, are they recovering within and across sessions? And then you get to this, it's going to be somewhere within that range, but you kind of work it out for yourself. And this can be something you vary it, like, you're going through a cut, so you're going to need to bring things down. But again, don't just assume it, because there's lots of things that go into training volume. So you auto-regulating, I think, within this range that a lot of you have described, anywhere from, I think, as low as 6 or even less, if you're looking to put it on the back burner, up to like this 30 sets is a good idea, and starting towards the lower end. Is that fair to say, if everyone's kind of nodding, that start towards the lower end and see how you get on?
Now start on the higher end, and if they get wrapped out, then you decrease the volume.
Yeah. And that, on that, then, is that a fair? I know, Menno, you kind of said it, like you have an opinion that there's a dose response to training volume and hypertrophy, so long as you're recovering. So if that person is looking to optimize for muscle growth, they do as much as what they can recover from in that kind of moment and build up to it over time. You can probably find you can recover from more. Is that where everyone is on this kind of subject matter, that like the more you can recover from, kind of the more growth you will get?
I'm a little, I think you definitely don't want to go to the point where training is no longer sustainable and you're sacrificing the workload under the curve over a longer period of time. And you almost certainly don't want to go to the point where you're definitely seeing regression on like a consistent basis, right? Beyond just like the one-off weird session or weird week, or maybe even bad 2 weeks, whatever the case may be. I do question the idea of optimizing for progression for hypertrophy specifically. I'll be honest, this is a little bit half-baked, but I would just put a little bit of uncertainty over that. The dose response between training volume and hypertrophy seems to be different than the dose response between training volume and strength. Now, there's a lot of factors that go into that. There's also, when you look at some of the analyses in terms of volume load progression throughout a training study, which there isn't a lot of that out there, but there is some. It's often a little bit less clear cut than you would think. So in other words, if someone's volume load goes up very clearly across the training program, that means they were able to progress more, right? They were able to add reps more often, or add load more often, or both. There seems to be a positive relationship, and that seems to strengthen in certain scenarios, specifically when it's like a single joint movement, and there's less of a skill component. But I would question optimizing for maximal progression in a given period of time. And the way that I've come to conceptualize it recently is more of a binary yes, no. Am I progressing? And if you are progressing, that means what you're doing is permissive. And that's not to say that more or less would be better or worse, but instead it's not necessarily holding you back over the longer term. And hey, maybe doing more at the cost of some progression over that time period could arguably be better. I don't know. I don't have the data to say that, but I think the ability to perform in the gym is different than the ability to maximize the stimulus from that session or from that week or from that training cycle.
So you're not suggesting people let their performance drop like session to session, week to week over time. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know where I'm going. It sounds like you're agreeing with the relationship between recovery and hypertrophy.
Yes,
I think I'd love to throw
what I'm
in.
saying is you don't want to just optimize for that. I view it as more of a binary.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think just again from the practical standpoint, in that regard, I think that's when I would start to look at modifying, your programs, rep ranges. I know we haven't really talked a whole lot about rep ranges at all, moving from strength into the hypertrophy space, but I know at least a lot of experiences that I've had personally, and then anecdotally through clients, is that when you're working in your lower rep ranges, focusing on strength, that tends to be a lot more taxing on the body. And I know for the women that I'm working with, and I would say, on average, I'm 35 plus. We're steering a little bit away from that type of training, just in that it does produce a lot of discomfort, a lot of pain, and it is, I guess, more people are more prone to injury, when they're lifting at such heavy loads. So I think the way that I have kind of changed my approach over the years is, whilst I love, and I think there's a lot of value to strength training specifically, and I think it really helps people wager what they should be doing for their hypertrophy training, to be honest, it is also really, really tough on the body. So I'm moving rep ranges, to, 12 plus, especially for some of my older people. And, we talked about, there's some subtle differences in younger people versus older people. So, those numbers are kind of moving around all the time. So I think, just to your point, Josh, when you were mentioning, you want to make sure that you're not under recovering and you're seeing performance decrements, that could certainly be one of the things that you could modify to prevent chronic pain and discomfort. I know I certainly experienced that a lot when I was heavy lifting. But one of the other things I think that I would love for you guys to collectively share, because I know it's asked of me all the time, and I think my perspective might be a little bit different, and that is just the, I guess, percentage increase in regional muscle growth within a given muscle. So, I mean, I've certainly read anywhere in the realm of, say, 4 to 8% of an increase. I know there's a lot of studies that talk about absolutes where, we might see this amount of lean tissue or fat-free mass accrue through various measuring tools. But as a percentage in regional muscle growth, what would be your take on that, so that people have a bit of a gauge when they start their building journey? If they're going to do, this focused, exerted period for 12 weeks, for instance, 2 6-week training blocks, what might they expect to see? If we've talked all about muscle thickness measures with what's the name of this meat that you've been talking about today, Sam? Pastrami, bologna, I don't know. Percentages. Let's talk percentages. What do we all think is realistic to expect for the listener?
I don't know who wants to start on this. I don't have an answer here.
I guess I'll kick it off, but I use percentages a lot less than I do magnitudes, and I have in front of me a table because I have been working on this paper, and I don't know if I'll ever publish it, but the idea of the paper was to look at normative changes in muscle size to give people expectations of what should you expect in biceps muscle thickness, what should you expect in biceps CSA, what should you expect in quadriceps muscle thickness, what should you expect in quadriceps CSA. And across 109 total conditions, the unweighted average was around 0.22, which is, I mean, the average biceps around 4. So again,
You're talking centimeters.
Yeah, 4 centimeters. I'm not gonna pull out the baloney again, but that's an 8-week change. In the quadriceps, it was only 0.26. So even though there's drastic differences in the size of those muscles, I think it's interesting that the absolute change is actually pretty similar. And I think that relates to, again, the allocation of resources, right? I think our body has a limited ability to add tissue over a given period of time. So I'm not answering your question of percentages, but I'm sneaking in the idea of competing resources. So I do think that the concept of just acquiring tissue is interesting, because you're placing a stress and you're trying to get an adaptation of increasing your skeletal muscle mass. And the more muscles you train, you have that demand coming from multiple muscles. So there's this idea that I think one of my former graduates is working on in his dissertation: allocation. If you train your biceps, your hamstrings, your glutes, if you train 10 muscles in a program, do you sacrifice growth across every muscle? as opposed to if you do a specialized program and you focus just on that muscle. And again, I'm going back to adaptation energy from Henselmans, that he said you only have a limited capacity to adapt over a given period of time. And adaptation energy is a very abstract concept, but I think, again, this might lend itself to why some of these research studies find pretty impressive things, because sometimes they leave out the back, they leave out the hamstrings, they don't train calves. There's less competition for allocation of resources, and resources are limited, adaptation is limited. And maybe that's why these snapshots are, in some cases, I think pretty impressive. Because like I said, I don't think, Steve's, I don't know if Steve, Holly, Holly, I'm going to say you're the most trained. Steve, I'm going to say that you are also very trained. And Menno, I think you're pretty well trained. Josh, me and you are scientists right now, so we can't be quite as trained as them. But I would wager that even though the average is 0.2 over 8 weeks, none of y'all are getting a full centimeter if you extrapolate that math. It's literally impossible. So, like, again, we have to think about, how do we actually apply this to real life? What does a study mean, right? And I'm rambling because it's such an interesting concept, right? I literally don't think you could repeat 0.2 5 times in a year, even though in an 8-week, I don't know if there's that many 8 weeks in a year. There probably is. Like, you couldn't replicate that because your muscles would be too large. You'd be on the Olympia stage, right? So with focused training, I think that's around the number that you said, Holly. It's around 4 to 8%. Sometimes you see these 12s, these 13%, and this is where it gets, very, very impressive in my opinion. And that's where we had a lot of our conversation around today. So I'm taking too much of the time. Menno, Josh, you guys have thoughts?
To answer your question, I think, yeah, that 4 to 8% number checks out to me. Obviously, depending on the training status and the study design, that's about what I saw in the studies I looked at, and I mentioned that earlier, is about 5%. This is kind of a quick look at a handful of studies from our lab, kind of plotting all of the muscle thickness changes for pecs, and then 2 sites on the vastus lateralis. Looks like, I don't have the percentages here in front of me, but looks like the pecs is around 2.5 millimeters, and then the vastus lateralis being at the more middle site being about 1 millimeter, and then at the more distal site being about 2.5 millimeters. Which, again, I don't know the percentage, but yeah, seems like somewhere around 0.2 centimeters or 2 millimeters, which maybe corresponds with somewhere in that 4 to 8%, I think is reasonable. But that is a very narrow look at the research in general. I'm sure we do things that influence those results a little bit in terms of our methodology. Another thing to think about is the type of measurement used. Probably my favorite paper in the field is from Cody Hahn. Something to the extent of biological construct of skeletal muscle. Its size matters, but so does the measurement. And basically, depending on the type of measurement you use, whether it's muscle thickness or it is some sort of whole body measurement or it is fiber cross-sectional area, one of the studies, one of the volume studies, the lead author is escaping me right now, use the cross-sectional area from ultrasound, right? These are all different methodologies that can influence the magnitude of change you see. So while I think it's important to contextualize it, different methods and different sorts of approaches are going to change what you actually see in terms of the percentage or the absolute difference.
Yeah,
If I could add to, you go ahead, man. I already talked.
No, I was going to say I don't have much to add to what you, Sam, and Josh said. You knocked it out of the park in terms of factual reference data, I think. I think in practice, though, most people don't really know like what these percentages mean and stuff. If I had to give percentages, I would say probably, like, I have a calculator on my website where you can calculate kind of what your a rough guide of your truly maximum natural potential. You can see the percentage of how far you are away from that. That might be more practically meaningful for most people, like 2% biceps growth. I mean, even if you do circumference measurements, I think it's very rough to use that in practice. The information, I think strength and total lean body mass, or at least weight gain during a bulk, for example, might be more actionable measures. But yeah, in terms of like the actual data for scientists and stuff, I think Sam and Josh absolutely knocked it out of the park.
I'll add one more thing because Josh was talking about some different muscle groups, so it made me think. I don't think it's uncommon to see a similar magnitude of growth between smaller muscles and larger muscles. And I kind of have maybe just a philosophical take on this. One thing that I've said in talks before is largely, I think we're limited by our measurement tools, and Josh alluded to the importance of measurement. But for the longest time, I think we have a good ability to say, did you grow or did you not grow? Beyond that, I think that's where things become a lot more difficult. Teasing out a difference between two conditions is, with our limitations on how good we are at our measurements and how precise our measurements are, combined with how slow muscle growth tends to be, makes it really hard to detect differences. So, like, for example, we're replicating the Schoenfeld study. And my recommendations for volume, I said somewhere between 3 and 4 sets. So that should tell you that my hypothesis should be that the 5-set group, or the 45 weekly sets, is going to be better than the moderate set. And I do think that that's probably true. Do I think I can measure that in my lab? I think it's going to be very difficult. I think I need to really know my area of my measurement, and I think I need a really decent sample size. And why do I think growth is going to be better? I think for a lot of people, 3 sets per exercise is enough. But I think for some individuals, if you do 3 sets, but your first set was junk, then you need a 4th set. And how often is that first set you just, like, practically in the gym, when you did a good set, or when you did a set and you didn't give all your effort, like, in my head, I don't count it. Right. But in research, you don't have that opportunity, and it's not typically written in the methods to ask, were you giving it your all, or were you just faking that set? Right. Or if you're having a bad day. Sometimes I'm having a bad day, and 2 out of my 4 sets, like, I don't think I really gave that my all. I need to do a few more. So I think the homogeneity of the response, like, I think it's gonna be better in the 5-set group, because I think there's a greater likelihood that everybody in the 5 sets actually fatigued and activated all the fibers involved in those movements. I think 70 to 80 to 85% in the 3-set are probably there, but it's that greater homogeneity in the response that's going to drive the 5-set to be better. Now, can I measure that? Well, with the rate of growth that I expect to see, and the difference you can anticipate to see between 3 and 5 being very, very small, I'm not confident that I could, and I have a lot of doubts. So hopefully that gives a listener a little idea of, I think sometimes this is how we think in science. And oftentimes I do expect differences in studies. I don't think we're good enough to measure these differences. So then, as a coach and a practitioner, you have to make those decisions, and you have to weigh it based on the weight of the evidence. And our lenses are all a little bit different, but me and Josh, I think, have become familiar with the limitations of what we're trying to do. And like I said, every time I recruit train people, I'm just crossing my fingers. I hope they grow. I hope they grow. I hope they grow. Right. But there's so much variability in where they're starting. Right. You recruit 50 people. They all say they train. Well, you find out pretty quickly that maybe 10 of them are pretty serious and very impressive. 20 of them, I don't know what you've been doing in the gym, but I'm not sure it's working too well. Or maybe it's 10 of them. But there's a lot of variability, which means that, the variability of the response is going to make it incredibly difficult to demonstrate what you're trying to demonstrate. So I think with continued good high-level science, it's going to become more and more clear. But and where did I even start with this point? I think the measurement. Yeah. So our measurements are just a major limitation. And that's another reason why, when there are big differences, I'm like, whoa, like I know I'd have such a hard time finding this, which is, so the study's cool, but I'm going to try to replicate it myself before I'm compelled to really buy in on this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, guys,
Yeah,
we've almost done 2 hours and a half here, so I'm gonna let you guys go. And I think this has been a really fruitful discussion, going around kind of your study, why it was made, the skepticism there, generally where you want to see the research go, how we can make this hypertrophy research better. I think that was a big part of why you did the paper in the first place, is to give direction for people on where they're going to go. And it sounds like you're taking that direction too. I'm excited for Josh's meta-analysis, meta-regression to come out on volume and hypertrophy in the future. And I just want to say a massive thank you for you guys doing science and chatting to one another cordially through this. And I think we gave some really quality practical recommendations towards the end so that people can take this away and kind of feel like they've got a bit more direction and where they're going, and also how they can view social media and research that's being communicated too. I think that's probably given them some more tools at their disposal as well. So thank you very much. I'll make sure that everyone's social media handles and their websites and everything are available, or ResearchGates, so that the research, and like I said, this paper also I'll have linked below as well so people can review that. So I just want to say a massive thank you for you all taking the time to be here today.
Appreciate it, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality, and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.